I didn't want the sweater in the first place. From the first time I laid eyes on the damn thing, I knew it would haunt me until the day I died. I first saw it in a thrift store window when I was 10 years old. It was a lumpy green thing made out of thick yarn, an ugly monstrosity that looked like someone's grandmother had knitted badly. As much as I hated it, I was also drawn to it. Even as I stared, I thought I could see a pair of big, goggly eyes in the pattern. Two sharp teeth floating amongst the swirls of thread seemed eager to bite me as I slid it on. The arms ended in little tassels that looked like claws. Sharp claws that looked like needles. I hated it, but I was drawn to it in that way that children are drawn to anything that might end their perceived immortality. Mom must have noticed my interest. 2 weeks later, just as the autumn chill began to rise, she gave it to me one morning so I could wear it to school. She pulled it out from behind her back, flourishing it like the end of some magic trick. She smiled hugely, clearly thinking she had something I really wanted. My stomach dropped when I saw it, and I was again filled with a sense of dread that she must have picked up on. "It's the sweater you liked so much," she said, looking a little hurt. "You really seemed taken with it when you saw it back at the store." Mom didn't have the money to buy me much. Dad had left when I was a baby, and she worked as a waitress to put food on the table and a roof over my head. We didn't have a lot of money for presents, and I could tell that however much this sweater had cost was too much for me to act anything but grateful. I pulled it on, not really wanting it on my skin, but pretending it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. It was made out of scratchy wool that I just knew at first glance would make me feel too warm. It rubbed at my skin like steel wool as it settled on my arms. It just felt wrong as it sat against my smooth skin, and I immediately wanted to take it off. It felt like there were bugs in it. As I walked to the door, I couldn't help but wonder if maybe roaches or earwigs had gotten into the fabric. She walked me to the bus stop, all the while smiling at me as I pretended the sweater wasn't the worst thing I'd ever worn. As the bus pulled away from the curve, I yanked it off and stuffed it in my backpack. My friend Mark looked at me strangely. "New sweater?" "Mom found it for me, but it's just about the most uncomfortable sweater ever." "I thought it looked kinda cool," Mark said. "Like Slimer from the Ghostbusters." The movies were pretty popular around this time, and I had to admit that it did look pretty ghoulish. The pattern on the front, big teeth and bug eyes, did make it look a little like the green ghost from the movie, and we talked about it all the way to school. I forgot all about the sweater until I got home that afternoon. I found it crumpled at the bottom of my backpack when I got started on my homework. I took it out and laid it over my desk chair. As I sat to do my homework, though, it began to itch at me. I took it and tossed it in a chair by the closet door instead, getting back to work. Even having it against my skin made me feel weird, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder at it as I did my homework. It felt like it was looking at me somehow, staring at me with those huge bug eyes, and I felt haunted by it as it sat placidly. When Mom came home a few hours later, she seemed happy to see the sweater. "I knew you would like it. Was it warm enough today?" "Yeah, it was just right," I lied. I finished my homework and went downstairs to help with dinner. Typically, I would have sat in my room or watched television till dinner was made, but tonight, I just wanted an excuse to be out of my room, away from the sweater. My room felt invaded every time I looked at it, and I just wanted to be anywhere but there for a few hours. I didn't think about it again until it was time for bed. I came into my room, pajama bottoms and white undershirt on, with my mouth still feeling minty from the toothpaste. I was ready to climb into bed when I saw the sweater again. For some reason, I just couldn't stand looking at it anymore. I picked it up, the coarse fabric scritching at my hands, and tossed it under the bed. I knew it meant nothing, a meaningless gesture, but I didn't want it watching me while I slept. Mom came in and kissed my forehead. "Good night, honey," she said as she turned off the lights and closed the door. I burrowed down under the covers and started getting comfortably sleepy. It had been a long day, with another one to follow, and as I began to edge towards sleep, I started to hear a weird noise from somewhere in the room. It sounded like someone dragging wire across the hardwood, and as I focused my attention on it, I could hear the sound sliding across the boards. I sat in my bed and looked for it, that harsh slithering that wound its way over the flooring. As I cast my eyes over by the chair, I saw the source of the noise. It was the sweater. It was sitting on the chair where I had thrown it earlier, leering at me with its toothy grin. It couldn't be there. I had thrown it under the bed. But there it sat, as though I'd never grabbed it in the first place. Maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe I hadn't thrown it. Maybe I'd just imagined the whole thing, and now I was just scaring myself. I rolled over and tried to get back to sleep. As I tossed and turned, though, I could almost feel those bug eyes looking at me. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to block it all out. As I lay there, I imagined I could hear that wire dragging across the wood again. It was like the scratching of claws times 10, and I could hear it going under my bed and towards the wall. I peeked out from under the covers and looked towards the chair, making sure that hideous sweater was still there and not responsible for the noises. The chair was empty, though. I sat straight up and peered around the semi-dark, searching for the sweater. It couldn't have moved. It was a sweater, a stupid sweater, and even my 10-year-old brain knew the sweater didn't just get up and move around on its own. I looked over the edge of the bed, seeing nothing, and hesitantly hung upside down so I could glance under the bed. In my 10-year-old brain, that was where the monsters lived, and this sweater had become a monster now. I peeked, afraid to see it, but it wasn't there. Only a few toys and some dirty clothes greeted me. I looked back at the chair, still finding it empty, and snuggled down under the covers so I could get some sleep. I awoke in the morning to a terrible pain in my arm. The sweater was in bed with me, curled around my arm as though it had gotten tangled on me in the night, and I wrenched it off violently. I didn't want it to touch me. I didn't want it to contact my skin. As I came free, I saw the source of the pain. On my forearm, on the inside of my arm, was what looked like a bite. As I inspected it in the dewy morning light, I felt sure I could pick out individual teeth marks on the flesh of my arm. I looked frantically at the crumpled green garment in the corner and suddenly felt sure that it was the source of the bite. I ran downstairs to show my mom, who was just starting to get breakfast things together. She looked at the bite and declared it a rash. "Probably from your new sweater," she said, and I could hear real sadness in her voice. She still believed that I really liked that ghastly thing, and the thought that it had caused me pain made her sad. She said she would wash it today after school and have it back to me by tomorrow, and I remember hoping that it shrank in the wash. I thought all day about the terrible garment coming back too small or shredded by some fluke, and the idea brought me some little amount of joy throughout the day. When I got home, however, I heard the washing machine in full swing and found a note on the table saying that Mom had gone to get groceries. I figured she put the sweater in with the load and went upstairs to start my homework. Mark and Davey wanted to ride bikes later, and I knew that if I got my math done before dinner, I'd be able to go riding with them before the sun went down. When I opened the door, I was startled by the green sweater sitting on the chair where I had left it last night. I was angry at myself for a moment. Why was I so afraid of this stupid sweater? I grabbed it up, yarn digging into my hands like steel wool, and took it to the laundry room. I opened the washer and threw it inside, slamming the lid closed and stomping back upstairs to start my homework. I finished quickly, and when Mom got home, I went outside to play. I spent the afternoon riding bikes and jumping dirt ramps with my friends, and as the streetlights came on, I turned for home. When it came time for bed, I walked back up to my room to find the sweater back on the chair where it had been earlier. There was a stack of freshly folded clothes on my dresser, but for some reason, Mom had put the sweater back on the chair. I walked around the sweater as I got ready for bed, but I kept thinking I could see it move out of the corner of my eye. It didn't leave the chair, but I thought I saw the arms wiggle or the waistband shiver slightly as I walked around the room. I went straight to bed after lights out, and in the morning, I found more bites on my arm. 3 new bites to be exact, each one on the underside of my arm, not on the outer arm where everyone might notice them easily, and each one looking much the same as the first. The sweater wasn't in bed with me this time, but I knew it had been the one to do it. Mom still thought it was a rash, but I was convinced that they were bites. For the next few weeks, I tried various measures to keep the sweater away from me. I left it in other rooms, sometimes with the door locked, but it always found its way back to my room. The closet was no obstacle at all for it, and twice I awoke to see it sitting in the chair as the door slowly closed behind it. One night, I stuffed it in the washing machine and closed the door locking behind it, and I still woke up the next morning to find it in my bed. My sleep started to suffer, and I found it hard to get a full night's sleep as I woke up to search for the sweater. My teacher told my mother that my performance was suffering, and I was given DRs several times for sleeping in class. If they'd seen what was under my sleeves, they would have probably had some questions for my mother, too. The bites were numerous, red and oozing blood sometimes. I kept them closely guarded, because if my teacher found out, I felt like my mother could be in big trouble. I kept them from both my teacher and my mother, not wanting her to ask questions either. And as it went on, our relationship became strained. She knew I wasn't sleeping well, but she wouldn't even entertain the idea that it was due to some evil sweater. She thought I was looking for attention, that I was just a typical child with an overactive imagination. But she couldn't take off work just to sit at home with me and protect me from a piece of clothing. At one point, she even threw the sweater in the garbage, thinking that would solve everything. But when it reappeared in my bedroom, she accused me of keeping it around to get attention. After 2 weeks of being terrorized, I decided to finally put a stop to it. That night, I stayed awake and watched it. The next day was Saturday, and I knew Mom wouldn't care if I slept in. I was going to catch it in the act and show Mom that it was hurting me. Maybe then she would let me get rid of it. I had a big metal flashlight with a thick blanket I was going to catch it in. I would hold on to it until it ran out of steam, and then show my mom so she wouldn't think I was dreaming. I watched the red numbers on my Ninja Turtles alarm clock tick slowly by, and by 11:30, I was having trouble staying awake. The sweater hadn't done anything but sit there all night, and as my eyes got heavier and heavier, I found myself slipping towards sleep. I lost the fight before midnight, and woke up with my head against the blanket. I looked at the clock and saw that the numbers read 2:45 a.m. I swept the light around the chair and tried to orient myself. The beam fell on an empty chair, and I couldn't help but feel dread mounting. Where had it gone? Had it slipped off the chair while I was asleep? As I searched for it in the beam of light, though, I heard a familiar sound of wire scraping against the wood behind me. I turned the beam onto my headboard, and there was the sweater. I thought for a moment that I might be dreaming, but as the flashlight illuminated it, I had to come to grips with the idea that what I was seeing was very real. The bug-eyed pattern had become a real set of bulbous eyes. The green body was a voluminous mass of fibers and filaments, and the teeth had become large and snapping. It was perched on my headboard, clearly startled by the sudden intrusion of light. It emitted a loud, otherworldly scream as it leapt at my face, and I swung the flashlight without thinking. It smacked into it with a soft woof sound, and I watched it fall to the floor next to the closet. The beam fell on it again, and it scrambled across the floor as it frantically crawled for the bed. I sat on the bed and listened as it rustled beneath the box spring. I had glimpsed its true form now. I had seen the wicked teeth that had left marks on my arm, and I was not about to let it sink them into me again. I jumped out of bed, flipping on the lights, and scooped up the sweater as I headed down the hall. The hall closet was stuffed with old tubs for storage. As I wrenched open the door, I found what I was looking for on the second shelf. Mom had an old popcorn tin, the kind you give people for Christmas when you're not sure what else to give them. As I reached for it, I felt the sweater shriek and scramble towards me. It knew what I meant to do, and it knew that it would be stuck if I did. I grabbed it before it could latch onto me and stuffed it down into the metal guts of the tin. I was going to trap it in here for good, a good long time, and there wasn't a thing that it could do about it. In the light, it was just an ordinary sweater. I made use of this knowledge and stuffed it into the tin. I heard it thrashing around in the tin and held the lid closed as I looked around for duct tape or something else to keep the lid closed. A few layers of tape over the lid, and I felt confident that it wouldn't be able to escape. I stacked a few boxes on top of it for good measure and left it thrashing at the bottom of the closet. As I went to sleep, I could still hear it beating feebly at its prison walls. The noise was like a lullaby for my tired soul. I'd like to say that this is the end of the ordeal, but this story is actually my reason for writing it all. It's been 25 years since that night, and I had all but forgotten about it. I had put it off as the overactive imagination of a child, just like my mother had, until I came home from work today. After college, I moved several states away, taking a job as an architect for a big firm in Chicago. That's where I met Emily, and now we have a child of our own, my daughter Carrie. My mother loves her granddaughter and comes to see her whenever she can, but most of the time, my mother's presence is felt through her packages. Cookies, toys, anything to make my daughter smile. And when I got home today, I found one of those packages open on the kitchen table. The box was empty, but there was a note inside addressed to Carrie. "Hi, Carrie. Grandma was cleaning out the attic and found something she thought you might like. It was your dad's when he was your age, and he used to make up all sorts of strange stories about it. It looked so lonely when I found it. I thought you might have more use for it than me in the Windy City. Love you, Grandma." As I looked at the note, my blood ran cold. What had my mother found tucked away in the attic? I walked out of the kitchen and into the living room, catching sight of my daughter as she lay on the living room floor. She was coloring something in her binder, using her crayons to fill in whatever picture she had just drawn. At that moment, though, my focus was on the familiar green sweater she was wearing. The yarn was a little faded, but the bug eyes still stared at me, and the teeth smiled with that delirious mirth. As I stared, it seemed to say, "Hello, old friend. Thought you'd gotten rid of me, huh? But here I am. Time for our game to start again." Carrie turned around and smiled at me, springing up and wrapping her arms around me in a big hug. I had to stop myself from shuddering as the sweater touched me, and she stepped back a little so I could see when she was done. She did a little twirl so I could take in the whole thing, and it didn't seem to repulse her the way it had always repulsed me. "Isn't it great, Daddy? Grandma sent me this cool new sweater. I love it. It's so soft and it's so warm." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded dumbly and walked back into the kitchen to fix myself a drink. After the second drink, I began to calm down a little, and I started writing this after my hands stopped shaking. I don't have a clue what to do. How do you tell your daughter that she's wearing something that tormented you for 2 weeks? How do you convey to her that something she loves is evil? What do I do when the bites start appearing? How do I rid myself once and for all of this evil sweater? The storm was one of epic proportions. It closed the schools for 3 weeks, right up until Christmas break. 4 days before Christmas, that was when I met her. "Better not stay out too late or Soap Sally'll get ya." Mom called this after me, right as I went out the door to go play with Rob and Terrell. I rolled my eyes, slipping on my mittens as I grabbed my sled from behind the door. "Sure, Mom, I'll be sure to watch out for Soap Sally." That was always what my mom told me. Her little attempt to scare me when I was a kid, I think. When I was younger, 4 or 5 maybe, Mom would use it to make sure I was inside before the street lights came on. I remember the first time she ever said it to me, the moment ingrained in my brain forever. I was heading out to play in the sandbox in the front yard, something Dad had spent all day building on his day off, and she had offhandedly told me to make sure I was in before the street lights came on, or Soap Sally would take me away. I had stopped, a little pail and shovel in my hand, and asked her who Soap Sally was. My mother just shrugged and said it was something her mother had always said, and the two of us had used it as our kind of personal joke from then on. "Better get the groceries in before dark," Mom would say. "Soap Sally might get you." "Better hurry up and take the trash out," Mom would say. "I think I hear Soap Sally prowling around." We'd done it for so long, it was just kind of normal. But I wasn't a baby anymore. I was 12, and I knew Soap Sally was just a boogeyman that adults used to scare kids. She was no more real than the Wampus Cat, another of my mother's colorful stories, and I put it out of my mind as I ran to join the others. Terrell had told us that his brother had told him about a big hill near Basker's Pond. "It's so steep that when you come down it, you almost fly," he said. So I trudged through the fresh powder, over the streets that no longer looked like streets at all, and made my way towards the edge of town. My hometown isn't very big, one of those 2 stoplights and a gas station kind of places you always drive through on your way somewhere else. There were maybe 20 kids my age in town, and our whole school could have probably fit in your graduating class. We knew we were living in a podunk town in the Georgia hills, and most of us dreamed about getting out after high school and doing anything but staying here. For some of us, that dream was actually realized. For others, the cemetery was all we had to look forward to. I met Terrell near Basker's Field, a small little picnic area that butted up against Basker's Pond. The pond wasn't huge, but it was a great place to swim and fish in the summertime, and just, kind of enjoy yourself. Today, however, it was a winter wonderland of fresh snow and chilling wind. Terrell was bundled up to the eyebrows in a thick ski jacket, and his snow pants had little rolls in them that made him look a little like the Michelin Man. He, too, was clutching a battered old sled, and when he spoke, I could see the air puffing from his mouth, even under his hood. "About time. Where's Rob?" That was when we heard a loud yell from up the road, and Rob came running with a banana yellow disc under his arm. He was wearing a matching ski suit and a pair of thick snow boots that seemed to be the only thing he wore that wasn't yellow. His voice cut through the sound of the wind like a foghorn, and I wondered if we were the only people in town not inside right now. It was a little spooky, even in the middle of the day. "Took you long enough," Terrell said. "Are you ready to sled?" "If this hill is half as cool as you say it is, T, then I'm ready to sled till midnight," Rob said, excitedly. With that, we set off. We had all seen the hill in question. Overlook Crest was the place to spread your blanket on the 4th of July to watch the fireworks, or to picnic on, or to just sit and watch the boats as they went out there fishing during the warm months. It offered a great view of the water, and as we trudged up it, the hill felt twice as steep as usual. The snow made it slippery, and the three of us were laughing and pushing as we reached the top. Terrell won, of course. Terrell was a beefy kid, and he was harder to push down than Rob, who was mostly skin and bones. He set his sled against the snow, and when he slid down, he really did seem to fly. We spent the day on the hill, sledding, snowball fighting, making snowmen, and generally enjoying the day. Blizzards like these were rare, and we'd been having a lot of days like this where we were just free to be kids and enjoy our childhood. Sometimes we linked up with others from school to have snowball fights or play games, but mostly it was just Terrell and Rob, and me, of course, enjoying the childhood we had before it was over. We had all expected it to end when we went to high school, the dying place of childish things, and not one of us could have guessed that it might be something childish that ended our innocence. I didn't notice it was getting dark until the streetlights came on and sent a dazzle of diamonds up from the snow. Ah, crap. Mom's gonna be mad if I'm late. "Oh, relax," Rob said. "It's not like we have school tomorrow. As long as you're home before bedtime, why would she care?" Rob's parents were never home, leaving him in the care of his aunts or his grandmother since they worked late. Terrell and I, however, had mothers and fathers who would expect us home when the streetlights came on, and I could see Terrell shuffling nervously too. We were all poised at the top of the hill, preparing to race to the bottom, and when Rob saw our looks, he rolled his eyes and jumped. "Last one to the bottom is a baby," he sing-songed. We all jumped then, putting on a burst of speed as we tried to catch him. As we came down, I began to hear a strange noise, the rumble of something rolling down the street, the jingle of an almost merry bell, and the hum of a gravelly voice. I looked around, trying to find the source of the noise, and that's when I saw her walk under a streetlight. It was an old woman, pushing a wheelbarrow or a small cart. We were heading right for her, and Rob was turned around backwards so he could laugh and mug at us. "Rob, look out!" He turned just in time to smack face first into the cart. We swerved to a stop, Terrell and I running down the hill the rest of the way. We could already see the old lady bending over him to inspect the prone boy, and under the glare of the streetlights, he looked pretty bad. There was a big gash on his forehead, the blood leaving red streaks down his yellow ski suit. Rob was groaning when we approached, and the woman looked up at us, smiling feebly as she rose to her full height. She was as wide as she was tall, and she was nearly 6 feet. She wore a voluminous black dress, her hair caught in a scarf or a kerchief that trapped it against her head. Her hands were liver-spotted, her fingers long and spidery as they sank back into her sleeves. The cart she was pushing seemed to be empty, and I figured she was on her way to pick something up when we bumped into her. There was a bell attached to it, and Rob flopped back against it, making it tinkle merrily. "Dear me, I didn't see you there, son. Are you okay?" she said in her thin, spidery voice. We helped Rob to his feet, but he was shaky and hardly able to stand. I was worried that maybe he had a concussion, maybe even a broken skull, and I wanted to help him get to the house as quickly as I could. Terrell asked the woman if we could borrow her cart, but she said she needed it later and couldn't loan it out. "But I'll help you get back to my cottage so you can call for help. I'll make you something warm to drink while you call your parents and let them know what happened. Put him in the cart now. You can help me push him back to my house." I was hesitant. Mom was always clear on not taking rides from strangers, and certainly not going to their house. But Rob groaned and wobbled then, which made up my mind. Our town was so small, after all. We may have never seen this lady before, but there was very little chance that she would want to hurt us, right? No one ever wanted to hurt us, and despite all the lessons about stranger danger, we had never even heard of anyone getting kidnapped. We loaded Rob into the wagon, the bell jingling as he slid in, and pushed it back the way we had come. As it turned out, the woman lived in the woods behind Basker's Park. The tires rumbled over the wood chips that led to her house, and Rob groaned as we jostled him in the cart. We had left our sleds behind, and we moved unburdened towards the dark little cabin at the end of the long road. It looked spooky at night, not a candle or a light inside. "You can push him right in the front door," she gravelled out. As we neared, something screamed at me not to go inside that house, though. common sense seemed to have reasserted itself, and when I paused on the steps to the front porch, the old woman and Terrell barely noticed. As the door came open, I could smell something like wax melting, a warm, aromatic smell of tallow. There were floral smells as well, and something akin to the cooking of bacon fat. There was another smell, though, something that prickled the hairs on the back of my neck. A coppery smell. A wet smell. And when I took a step back, the old woman seemed to notice that I hadn't come inside. She turned in the doorway, and we made eye contact for a few seconds before she asked why I wasn't coming in. I just remembered that I thought of something, anything, and landed on a flimsy lie. My dad, he's coming to pick us up, and if he gets there and we're gone, he'll be worried. I probably need to... I turned to go back down the cedar path, but suddenly her hand was around my wrist. I felt my breath catch as I looked down at those long, spidery fingers. The bones creaked beneath her skin, and the flesh around them was so thin that I imagined I could see them through the pale wrapper. As firm as her grip was, her skin was waxy and slick. It reminded me of nothing so much as candle wax, heated tallow, and when I looked into her face, I could see nothing human there. Her face looked like an exceptionally well-crafted mask, a mask made of human skin. "Come inside," she whispered, and I could see that her mask bore too much makeup. She had really caked it on, and it made her look almost clownish. Whoever had applied it roughly. Her eyes were like black pits beneath all that dark eyeshadow. I whispered, my tongue now dry as it battered against my chapped lips. "I just need to tell my dad where Your father can't help you now," she breathed, grinning with her mouth full of gravestone teeth. "Don't worry, you'll see him very soon." She yanked my arm then, and I saw my one chance to escape. I pulled back hard, nearly toppling her from the porch, my arms slipping out of her greasy grip. I was running flat out as she cawed angrily behind me. I didn't stop running until I reached my house. My mom was waiting for me on the porch, looking angry as I came running up. She asked what I thought I was doing out so late. She asked if I meant to meet Soap Sally, as she always joked about. She asked me if I intended to freeze to death out in the snow. All those questions went unanswered. All her anger disappeared as I wrapped my arms around her and told her that some old lady had taken Terrell and Rob. She called the police, but seemed angry when she hung up. She told me that they must have thought she was someone pulling a prank. They told her that they would get right on that, and the next time Soap Sally came after her to make sure there was less than a foot of snow on the ground. She sent me to bed, but my dreams were full of the old woman and her deep, pitiless eyes. In my dreams, she got me. In my dreams, she cackled as she peeled my skin. I woke up the next day to hear Mom on the phone with Terrell's mom. "He came home in a state last night. Said some lady had Terrell, just like I told you last night. Didn't you find anything? I'll ask him once he gets up. If he comes home, let me know, please." She hung up the phone and came to talk to me. The police came by later that day to question me. I guess they were taking the disappearance of 2 children a little more seriously now. I told them exactly what I had told my mom. Rob had hit his head, and the old lady had offered to help us. We put him in the cart and pushed him to her house. I got spooked and tried to run, but she grabbed me. I got free and ran to the house. I told my mom what had happened, and she called the police, but they didn't believe her. It seemed like they were interested in this house now and asked me to take them there. I gave them directions, but I refused to go anywhere near that place. They came back later and told me that the house appeared to have been abandoned for years and asked me if I was sure. I told them I was, and they said all they had found was a bit of dried blood and a black dress that might fit a horse. They didn't believe me, that much was apparent, but they believed me after the soap arrived. I woke up one morning about a week after Rob and Terrell disappeared and walked downstairs to the smell of breakfast. Mom was making flapjacks and bacon, and the smell turned my stomach a little as the familiar odors assaulted my nose. To this day, the smell of hot fat makes me want to puke, and the smell of it always takes me back to that house and that day. "Sweetie, could you bring the milk in off the front porch?" I looked outside. "Snow's 3 feet deep, Mom. I doubt the milkman ran today." "Well, I heard someone on the porch a few minutes ago. They left something and didn't knock. See if it's the milk before it freezes, please." Sitting on the mat was a small wicker basket. Sitting on a bed of black cloth were square packages wrapped in wax paper. I felt my breath hitch as I saw the cloth, but tried to shake it off. What didn't remind me of the old woman in the woods these days? I reached down to pick up the package and felt the semi-solid brick of soap as it smushed a little between my fingers. I unwrapped it, not sure who would leave soap on the doorstep, and that's when I saw the note. It was under the soap, written in a long, spidery hand, and the words sent a shudder through me that the winter chill couldn't top. "See you soon." I felt the soap slip from my numb fingers. When it hit the boards, I looked down and saw something that pushed a scream up my throat. It was a bone. A finger bone. The police told my dad that it was Rob's finger bone, but they found trace evidence of Terrell's bones in the other bar of soap. Both their parents had received similar baskets of soap, and, unfortunately, Rob's grandmother had brought it out of the bathroom when the police came to check. She had been washing her hands with it all day, having no clue that she was washing her hands with her grandson's body. My own grandmother came to visit a few days later. She and Mom had a long talk about something, and I got the feeling that Mom didn't want her to tell me something. As she shuffled to my room, I couldn't help but shudder as I imagined my door opening to reveal a huge woman in a black dress and a shawl leering at me as she smiled with her witch's grin. When Grandma knocked, I told her to come in. She sat down on the bed and seemed to think about what she meant to say. "I grew up in this town too, you know that. One night my friend Grace and I were late coming home from a church dance. We cut through the park, and as we passed by the sign that said, 'Welcome to Basker's Park,' we saw an old woman who was trying to fix her cart. She asked us to help her get the cart to her house, and we obliged. No sooner had I seen her house, though, than I got a tickling feeling. My mother had told me about Soap Sally, too, and I suddenly realized what the smell was around that cart. It was tallow and lye and blood. I ran as quick as I could, and I never saw my friend again. You got real lucky, kiddo, but don't press your luck by being careless," she said, giving me a little hug as her bones creaked in that way that Soap Sally's had. She left me then, and we never spoke about it again. That was 5 years ago. 5 long winters ago. The snow is back, and the days are short, but I haven't left my house after dark, not since that night I lost my best friends. Though I never saw her again, I know she has seen me. Sometimes I hear the grumble of that cart, the tinkle of the bell, and it sends me running home as surely as it did the night I escaped her. My greatest fear is that she will make good on her threat one day. One day, Soap Sally may leave me on my parents' front porch, their missing son, unknowingly come home. I've worked at the homeless shelter in my town for about 7 years. In 7 years, I've done just about everything there. Cooked the food, cleaned the toilets, set up and run the AA meetings, done the little security work. Hell, I've been a glorified babysitter more nights than I can count. In all that time, though, I've come to care for the people who wander in, looking for a dry place to sleep and a warm bed for the night. I know everyone who works night shifts says this, but the night shifts at the shelter really are different from day shift. The day shift has no less than 6 staff in the kitchen. That's helpers and a chef, though he's less of a 5-star chef and more of a Waffle House fry cook. They've got 5 therapists and a doctor, as well as 3 nurses in the medical facility, and 6 staff members who do everything from answer the phones to clean the toilets. During the day, this place is more like a Howard Johnson than a shelter, but at night, it's more like a youth hostel. The night shift has 5 employees, a cook and a kitchen helper, both of whom are gone by 10, a nurse, who mostly tries to keep everything stable until morning, and 2 staffers who keep the place from falling apart. I am one of the latter. It's a strange way to do things, I know, but management figures that at night the residents should be sleeping and thus need less care. In all the time I've been here, I've broken up many, many fights. held a lot of hands while people were puking their guts out, waited on ambulances while someone had a seizure or went into convulsions, and herded scared residents into the hallway while someone went through a violent DT spell or ripped the dorm apart. I've also seen a small group of residents put on a production of A Christmas Story, seen them exchange gifts under a tree on Christmas Day, throw a regular resident a surprise birthday party, and help each other through loss and pain. The homeless community is a lot more tight-knit than anyone would ever believe, and despite its many problems, I've never had an incident like I did the night in question. That was the night that all hell broke loose. It happened about 3 weeks ago, December 18th, and I had just walked in out of a nasty blizzard. The weather is never what you'd call good, but today's weather was a killer. I crunched in a little before 6 and said hi to Janice, who was at the front desk that night. She looked up from her Candy Crush long enough to give me a half-hearted wave, which I returned before heading to the cafeteria. Dinner service was just starting, so I put on an apron and helped out. Chad, the shelter cook, doesn't like non-kitchen staff in the kitchen area, so I bypassed the back and took a spot on the line, where I passed out bowls of soup and grilled cheese sandwiches. I greeted some familiar faces, talked to some people I knew for a few minutes, and scanned the room for my regulars. There are many faces you know in a shelter, and those were the faces that I was looking for. I saw Lou and Chuck sitting around a table that was packed with other drifters. Chuck was telling a long and excited story to a crowd of homeless and stopped long enough to wave at me when he saw I was looking at him. Lou waved too, smiling, and Chuck went back to telling his story. While Lou was a classic example of a city vagrant, Chuck was what you'd call a traveler. He'd been here a few months, said he liked the architecture of our town, but before that, he claimed he'd been most everywhere. I've picked oranges in Florida for 50 cents a crate. I've brought in Idaho spuds for $2 a bag. I've worked in greasy spoon diners and driven cabs in New York City. And I'm here to tell you, girl, that I've seen just about everything this great nation has to offer. Probably saved a bundle, seeing as I saw it on my own 2 pins, too, he said as he slapped his leg and chuckled. He and Lou had palled around for a while, and I like to see someone looking out for Lou. As a recovering heroin addict, he doesn't always remember things so well, and if someone like Chuck or Lenny were looking out for him, he'd be less likely to stumble into traffic or hunt for a needle again. As though summoned by the thought of his name, Lenny came stomping up right about then and gave me his trademark Lenny smile, which showcased all 5 of his teeth. "Evening, Miss Liz. How's your night going so far?" I didn't immediately respond, though. Someone in the back had caught my eye. He looked like a mall Santa who had come wandering in for a bite before his shift, and it was certainly the right time of year for him. He wore a dark red cap, had a long white beard that hung to his waist, and was dressed in an old red ski jacket, topped off with a pair of scuffed black motorcycle boots. He sat in the back and ate his meal, and I could see the end of a gnarled wooden stick leaning against the wall within easy reach. He had a big old stained traveling sack perched on it, and it only enhanced the idea that he was some kind of Santa Claus. Lenny looked back to where I was looking for a minute before trying to bring me back to reality. "You know that old man, Miss Liz?" he asked, genuinely curious. I shook my head. "No, Lenny, I don't think I've ever seen him before. Have you?" Lenny shook his head in a slow, deliberate way. "No, ma'am. I guess he must be from out of town, like Chuck," he said as he pointed to old Chuck, who was miming a fishing net that was full, it seemed, as he yanked it out of somewhere. I gave Lenny his food and made small talk. He responded with his usual sermon. He had woken up, got dressed, and he and Lou had gone down to Panhandle on their favorite corner. They had left before noon, since that's when the cops usually came around. They'd eaten their lunch at the shelter, then spent the afternoon looking for cans and bottles to recycle. Each of these pronouncements contained a "by Jesus" or "by the grace of God, amen," and Lenny was a firm believer in the power of God, and believed that his mercy was the reason he was still alive today. A staunch atheist I may be, but I wasn't about to dampen his spirits. I gave him an extra grilled cheese, and he went over to sit with his friends. After dinner service, most of the residents went to the activity room to watch TV, or hung out in the dining hall to talk. I took this opportunity to visit one of my friends in the medical bay before it was time to call lights out. The medical door sits right across from the welcome desk, where Janice was still on her phone as she had been earlier. I ducked in and received a nod from Miss Casterly, our resident night nurse, and I said hello to some of my other residents that were in here. Miss Casterly and I have a lot in common, at least in my mind. She's a retired school nurse with 5 years of nursing school before discovering her passion for teaching. Her job is to put band-aids on it and keep it from getting out of control until the doctor gets here in the morning. In many ways, I have much the same responsibility. I've always seen us as soldiers in the same war, and I think she senses that when we talk. John was in the back. His legs were still wrapped up, and he was covered in quite a few blankets, as the IV dripped him full of warmth. John was one of the residents I had hoped to get off the streets, and before his accident, I thought I had succeeded. He'd been an engineer before his wife left him, and his depression had caused him to slip into a dangerous spiral that had ultimately landed him on the streets. When I found out about his background, I had started trying to help him find a job so he could get back on his feet. When a local factory needed a machinist, John had agreed to give it a try. Then, 2 weeks ago, he'd gone and dropped off the face of the earth. I'd almost given up on finding him again when the hospital called me a few days ago. He'd given them my name just before they were going to kick him out, and I helped him get back to the shelter so he could recover. It turned out he and 5 other homeless guys had been caught out in the blizzard and nearly froze to death under the East Side overpass. His legs had been frostbitten pretty good, but thanks to the hospital, he was recovering nicely, and thanks to the shelter, he'd be able to finish recovering without being turned back out into the blistering cold. He greeted me, and we talked for a few minutes about nothing in particular. I asked him about his recovery, and he said he thought he'd be better in a few days. He asked me if I'd heard from the factory about the job, and I told him they had been understanding once I explained his situation. They had asked me to get in touch with him after John was feeling better, and I told them we certainly would. John thanked me for working so hard for him, and after a little more small talk, I excused myself to go check on the dorms. Had I stayed any longer, I likely wouldn't be alive to tell this story. I had left medical and was going into the dorm area when I heard the front doors open. I felt a blast of cold air run across my back, and I turned to see who'd come in out of the chill. I felt myself stiffen, however, as I saw them. 3 men in overcoats with huge scarves covering their mouths. I couldn't have told you why at the time, but they just struck me as wrong. Their posture made me think of something not quite human, that crouched way of standing that you sometimes see in primates. The way they held their heads made me think their faces were oddly elongated too. They hadn't seen me yet, and their attention was focused on Janice as she rose to greet them. She got up and walked towards them, asking them to sign in and brandishing a clipboard at them. That was when one of them reached out and broke her neck. Now, I don't mean that they used ESP or telekinesis or anything. When I say they reached out and broke her neck, what I mean is that his hand moved so fast that I couldn't even see it. Janice fell with her head twisted all the way around, and I was left gazing in a stupor. She hadn't moved. He hadn't moved, except for his hand, and she suddenly went from being alive to being dead in the space of 2 seconds. As her body crumpled to the floor, her killer made a muffled sound like a cat yowling and ripped the scarf off his face. Underneath, its face was the no color of static, and its skin seemed to crawl like an army of dead white ants. His face opened and his mouth elongated like a snake dislocating its jaw as it fell on her and started tearing her clothes off. It ripped them open, like you or I might tear the wrapper off a candy bar, and it bent its face down as it bit into her. It pulled and tore chunks of meat away with hungry, feral bites, and it didn't chew the meat so much as the meat dissolved when it came in contact with his skin. I know that's a lot to process, and I know it sounds like it might take a while, but this whole exchange happened in less than a minute from beginning to end. 1 minute Janice was getting up to ask the strangers to sign in, and a minute later she was being chewed on like an animal in a National Geographic film, while I stood there frozen to the spot. I know that makes me sound like a coward, but I couldn't help it. The scene before me was so alien, so shocking that my mind almost couldn't process it. As the killer hunched, eating, its friends turned and headed into the medical area. Miss Chasterley said something as they came in, but it was drowned out as the whole room erupted into shouts of terror mixed with breaking furniture and alien yowls. Then, the thing looked up, noticing me for the first time, and the sight of this strange face and its sewing needle teeth moved me to action. I turned and ran through the double doors that led to the dorm and slammed them shut behind me. I slammed my fist onto the big red button on the wall and sighed as the maglocks engaged behind me. The state required us to install them on the doors to the medical and the dormitory area, which led to the back office. Since both areas contained confidential files, we had to have a way to secure them, and what better way than magnetic locks that exert 1,000 pounds of pressure? I put my back against the door, knowing that these things couldn't get in through that, and we'd be safe until they left or the police arrived. Knowing this, I still screeched when it hit the door hard enough to rattle it in the frame. The residents started coming out then, and the corridor was soon filled with the sounds of running feet and raised voices. Before I knew it, I had 20 or so upset people behind me. When Lenny put a hand on my shoulder, I jumped to the ceiling. His face was ashen, and I could tell that he'd caught a glimpse of the hallway behind me. He opened his mouth, probably to ask what was going on, when an inhuman scream pierced the hallway, and something hit the glass on the door hard enough to send cracks running through it. That worried me more than a little, because that glass is supposed to stop a bullet. The first bullet, at least. This thing had just cracked it with a single hit. The second hit bulged it grotesquely inward, and the third turned it into a square of broken glass and twisted metal rebar. An arm stretched through, and began hunting for a latch then. "Lisa, get back!" someone yelled, and I saw Chuck run forward with a fire extinguisher in hand. He slammed the butt of the canister into the arm, but it did no more damage than the shards of glass had. The arm continued to rake around, searching for some way inside, and when Chuck brought the canister down for the third time, it finally seemed to register. It swiped out with those long nails, and the canister parted easily, spraying clouds of foam into the air. Chuck let it go and threw the sputtering thing at the arm, backtracking as he moved towards the group. He turned to me then, and I suddenly realized they were all looking at me, looking for me to guide them out of this situation. I almost laughed at them. What part of this did they think was in the Homeless Shelter Management Handbook? There was no protocol for being set upon by a group of monsters who ignored the laws of nature and did whatever they wanted. They wanted me to help them, but I doubted that anyone could help them. We weren't people to these things. We were just troublesome food bits stuck at the bottom of a can. We were trapped in here, and it was only a matter of time before they knocked down the door, maglocks or not, and turned this hallway into a slaughterhouse. I fell to my knees, wanting to bring them up to my chest, and my body longed to drop to the floor so I could spend my last few minutes hugging myself in terror before the end. I had started to do just that when the sound of a walking stick brought me back to reality. The man who looked like Santa Claus came out of the dormitory and smiled at me in a decidedly up the chimney he goes kind of way. He said not a word, but went straight to his work, and as the creature's hand scampered about like a long-nailed spider, he drew close and stopped just out of arm's reach. The owner of the hand stopped reaching, and I heard a wet noise that sounded like the worst head cold in history. The thing sniffed at the air like a man sucking up soup, and it said something that I'll never forget. I had to look it up afterwards when I was in my right mind again, but it uttered a single muddy word before trying to pull its hand away. It said Sacerdos and tried desperately to get its hand out of the hole. The old man shot his hand out, quick as a snake, and gripped the wrist in a single gnarled old hand. The creature squealed, the scream too high to be called a scream, really, and the corridor was filled with a pulse of white light. Then it dimmed, and I saw the arm no longer attached to the creature. It disintegrated before our eyes into something like oatmeal and sawdust. The creature went crazy then. Its screams were full of terrible fury as it slammed its misshapen face into the little window and gnashed its two big teeth at the little man. He snapped a finger out then and booped the grotesque thing on its flat nose. In another bright flash, the creature was gone, little more than a greasy cloud in the space of the little window. Through the hole in the door, I could see the other two lumbering out into the hallway, streaked with gore and not even trying to hide their strangeness. I looked over at the little man standing placidly by the door. Some black substance had splashed onto his coat, but he didn't seem to notice. I started getting nervous around him the longer he stood there. The hellish creatures were trapped outside the room, but how dangerous was this seemingly harmless old man who'd reduced one of them to nothing with a flash of light? When you work with the homeless for long enough, you start to question things like miracles or even the concept of change itself. This old man had just done something that I couldn't explain, and he felt like a piece in a game I didn't understand. A piece that was counter to the things outside, I hoped. "Miss, I want you to release the door and let me out into the hallway," he finally said. I gaped at him. "Sir, those things will kill you. I've already watched them kill at least one person tonight, and I'm not in a big hurry to watch them tear you apart, too." He smiled at me in that Santa Claus way of his. "Oh, I don't think so." I had wondered what brought me here tonight. It appears that the powers that be knew that this was where I needed to be the most. I started to argue with him, but something in his eyes told me that he was going out there, whether I wanted him to or not. I pushed the button, and the door opened. He walked out and said the last thing I ever heard him say. "You won't want to watch this." He strode towards the pair of them as I re-engaged the lock. Suddenly, my eyes were assaulted by a bright flash of light like nothing I had ever seen. I fell behind the door, shutting my stinging eyes, and I could hear other residents yelling in similar pain. The creatures screamed in agony, and under that din, I could hear a sound like sizzling bacon as the old man went about his butcher's work. The whole thing lasted less than a minute, but it was a whole 10 minutes before I could see through my watering eyes. Standing shakily, I looked through the window hole and saw that nothing but the empty hallway remained. No blood, no bodies except for Janice's, and no evidence that any of them had been there at all. I called the police and Mrs. Stone, who's responsible for the interests of the benefactors. The police arrived first. The ambulance they brought with them was a welcome sight. Janice was pronounced dead at the scene, along with 10 others in the medical bay, Miss Chasterley among them. The medics said that it looked like a wild animal had attacked them, and big pieces of flesh had been torn out of them, along with some of their softer parts. The worst was their eyes, which had simply been devoured by whatever had attacked them. And no one was left alive to tell the police anything. The residents and I told them about the 3 men, omitting the old man, but the officers didn't seem to believe that a monster had attacked us. They said it was likely a group of mentally unstable residents with masks that had maybe had a personal grudge against the shelter, and that out of shock, we had concocted the rest. Miss Stone arrived then, and I had to tell the story again, but I don't think she believed me either. I was given 2 weeks paid time off while the shelter was repaired, but I'll have to think long and hard about whether I want to return. The idea that this might happen again, has likely happened before, chills me to the bone and makes me question everything I've ever believed in. Who was that old man? Was he an angel? A messenger from God? A creature from space? And what does that make those things that attacked us? I spent the last 3 nights trying to find forgetfulness in the bottom of a whiskey bottle. Every time I close my eyes, though, I can still see those things. I probably always will. I'm sharing this so maybe less equipped shelter workers will read it, and it might help them should this happen to them. They come at night, and they attack your wounded first. They kill without remorse. If I'd seen them on the street, I would have thought they were just normal people. But their coats hide monsters like nothing you'd ever expect. If it happens to you, then I wish you luck. If they find you, then I just hope the old man found you first. I've been living rough for about a year now. It's not as bad as you'd think. Not really. When COVID hit, I lost my job. The food industry got hit pretty hard, and the catering business I worked for had suddenly closed up shop. When I couldn't pay my rent, my landlord put me on the street. I suppose I could have gone and gotten an assistance check, but I met some guys at a soup kitchen I was crashing at, and they invited me to come live rough with them. For the last 9 months, I've been traveling from town to town with a great group of guys who've been homeless for years. I know this makes me sound like a tourist, but it's really not as bad as you'd think. I've been enjoying a freer lifestyle than I ever had before. I travel around with 4 guys, and they keep an eye on me, and I keep an eye on them. They call me Kid, and I'm lucky to have fallen in with them, all things told. Travis is a vet from Iraq who couldn't seem to live in an apartment after spending 6 months in an Iraqi prison. He's a rough guy, but very protective of his squad, which I guess is us now. Conley is more like a classic tramp. He's old enough to be my granddad and seems to get by mostly on panhandling. He can be real charming, and he's amiable enough, whether he's drunk or sober. He's more than happy to share what he makes with the rest of us, too. Then, of course, there's John. Of the 3, I think John is the one I like the best. He reminds me of my dad somehow. He's tall and thin with bushy eyebrows and a thick salt and pepper beard. He works as a handyman sometimes to make money, and he seems more than content to keep a protective eye on all of us. Despite Conley being 15 years older than him, you can tell that he thinks of all of us as his kids. He was very protective of us, and I spent many nights around a campfire with the 3 of them. John was always at the head of the fire, like a father at his table, and we often told stories as we hunkered around our camp. On the night in question, we were telling scary stories. We had camped in the woods off the interstate, far enough in that our fire couldn't be seen from the road, and we were eating food we had all bought and telling tales. Conley was talking about a ghost story he had heard in Denver, and Travis told us about a ghost soldier spotted around the barracks he was assigned to in Iraq. I told one of my many creepypastas I'd read during my other life, and finally we looked at John. John was eating quietly through it all, and now seemed intent on continuing his dinner. "Your turn, Dad," I said, using the teasing nickname I had fixed on him. "I don't really like to tell stories," he said, and his voice had a hollow tone to it as he busied himself with his can of stew. "Come on, John," said Conley, already sounding like his dinner was affecting him. "We all told a story. Now it's your turn." I was sitting next to John at his right hand, and I saw him darken a little as Conley prodded at him. "Easy, Conley. If John doesn't want to tell a story, then he doesn't have to." "Fine. You guys want a story? I got a story for you." John sounded a little mad, and Conley raised his hands in a placating way as he told him it was fine. "It's a great story. I think you'll love it. Gather up, kids. It's a real doozy." He reached over and took the bottle of rot gut from Conley, taking a deep swig before he started. He sounded flustered, out of sorts, and I kind of didn't want him to tell it now. Clearly something was going on here that was outside the norm, and I was afraid of what might happen after his story was told. Want it or not, though, John began. "It was midnight, just like tonight. The August wind was creeping in from the east, cold and hungry, as the 2 boys sat around their campfire, munching their dinner of beans. They didn't have the luxury of a home or a hearth, only having the other in this world. Their parents had cast them out, not having enough money to feed them any longer, and the 2 boys had been riding the rails, seeking their fortunes as they tried to make it day by day. The 2 boys had managed to beg enough for a can of beans, and as they sat around the fire, they listened to the bubbling inside as their stomachs growled and their mouths watered. They hadn't eaten in 3 days, you see, and the smell of them beans was enough to make them ravenous. They sat closer to the fire, basking in the smell of the cooking beans, and that's when they heard the cry. The 2 huddled close to the fire, shuddering as the howl glided up between the trees. Their campfire wavered under the torrent of wind, and they hunkered close as they tried to keep alive. They blocked it with their bodies, feeling the icy bite of the wind as they tried to cook their dinner. The howl growled across their shivering skin, and the 2 boys wondered if that would be their last meal. The beans began to boil over the lip of the can, and the older boy's threadbare glove to allow him to slide it from the flames. He poured the beans into a tin cup for his brother, gritting his teeth as the heat became too hot even for his gloved hand. As he poured, he could feel something stalking behind them, it had smelled their food and came to look. If they were lucky, it was just a little cat or a mangy dog that would leave if they shouted. If they weren't, then the older boy would stand against it while the brother ran. Either way, the two would eat a few mouthfuls of beans before they died. He wrapped his scarf around the can gingerly, holding it by the tatty garment as he tipped the scalding beans into his mouth. They burned his tongue and blistered his throat, but his hunger was too great to wait. His brother moaned in pain as he did the same, the two of them feeding their bodies as the scalding food nourished them. And all the while, the beast howled and stalked behind them. Neither boy looked into the dark woods. They knew that something stalked them, that something wanted them desperately, but they thought that if they ignored it, it might just pass them by. As it moved around them, the oldest could see that it was like a dog. It capered about on all fours, its teeth bone white as it grinned at them. It stalked their little fire, circling the pair 3 times before stopping. It stood between the two, its arrow-shaped head pushed in close. The two boys ate, trying to ignore it, not wanting to see it, and hoping it would just go away. When it spoke, the younger of the two began to cry in terror.
You come into my woods, bring your destructive fire, and then you don't even offer me a proper gift. What rude children you are. I should punish you for such insolence.
The boys begged the creature, saying they had nothing to give, but the creature only scoffed.
You should have thought of that before entering my woods.
The two boys begged him for mercy, to take pity on 2 starving children.
Mercy is not a trait I ever saw a need to learn. Those who enter my realm bring me gifts. You will present me with a gift, or you will suffer my wrath.
He spoke with a sense of refinement that was at odds with his monstrous nature. The boys had still not summoned up the courage to look at him, and now they shuddered against each other as they thought of what to do. The oldest looked at his still warm can of beans in his hand and saw that he had 2, possibly 3 bites of beans left. He held them out to the creature, still not looking at him, and hoped it would be enough. The creature approached, sniffing at the can, and a weight slid into the warm vessel. It slurped as its long tongue lapped at the beans, smacking as it tasted the juice and liking what it found.
Lovely.
The creature purred, turning its head towards the younger, who had begun to shake.
And you? Share with me what is in your cup, little one, and you might be allowed to live through the night.
The youngest had his hand over the mouth of his cup, unwilling to move it. His brother told him to give the creature a taste. Then they could leave this place and never come back. The youngest boy shook his head again. The creature put his face very close to the boy and demanded that he remove his hand in a low growl. The boy's shaking hand slid from the cup opening, and the brother felt his stomach drop. The younger boy had wolfed his beans, eating them all, and had nothing to show but a cup of juice residue. The older boy could see his tears cutting lines down his dirty face, leaving trails of pink against his skin. He started apologizing, hastily and low to the older boy, saying he just couldn't help himself. As the creature asked for his due, the younger could only hold out his shaking, empty cup for the beast to inspect. The tongue slid into the metal, making a soupy, gloopy noise as the creature searched for food. And as it slid out, the two heard the creature tutting in disappointment.
What a shame.
Suddenly, the warmth of the brother's forehead was gone, and the forest was filled with the sounds of his younger brother screaming. The older brother curled into a ball, shuddering and weeping as he heard his brother torn to pieces. He closed his eyes and begged God to make it over, but it was some time before the forest was quiet again. He lay there listening to the wind howl, his campfire guttering out as he shivered in the dark, alone. The three of us sat speechless, looking at John as the campfire crackled before him. Out in the woods, an animal loosed a long, mournful howl, and Conley suddenly decided to sleep under the nearby overpass. "It's chilly, but at least I won't get ate up by no beast." Travis agreed, and the two grabbed their stuff and moved on. "Better go join them," John said, poking at the fire as he looked into the flames. "Sounds like an old friend is looking for his due." I heard something in his words I didn't like, something akin to a suicidal friend telling you it's fine to leave them alone, but I got up and followed the others anyway. The last time I saw John, he was still staring into the flames. We looked for him the next day, but he was nowhere to be found. We found the old campsite. We found his pack, but of John, there was no sign. By midday, we just assumed he had left, and we moved on. I'm still not entirely sure what happened to him, but if you meet John on the road somewhere, tell him his troop misses him. And if you meet the creature from his story, I hope you saved it some beans. Otherwise, you might discover what really happened to John on that windy December night by the interstate. When you read this story, you may think that my punishment was fitting. When you read this story, you may believe that I got exactly what I deserve. But what you should remember is that my actions were the actions of a child, actions that were judged by someone of a near godlike stature and levied against an 8-year-old girl who may not have fully grasped the consequences of her actions. I believe I should have been punished. I even believe I should have been punished harshly, but I do not believe I should have been made to suffer for 30 years of my life over the actions of an 8-year-old girl. It sits even now on my mantelpiece, glaring at me like some disquieting idol, and even as I sit in my cold apartment, I can feel its hate. I'm rambling. Let me start at the beginning. When I was 7 years old, I had the worst year of my life. My mother died on Christmas Day after a long battle with cancer. My father was always at work, always busy, never had time for me, which meant my mother and I had always been close. When she'd gotten sick, I had immediately spent every waking moment I could at her side in the hospital. Dad was busy, too busy for his dying wife or his hurting daughter, and it was up to me to watch her slip away over the course of 9 months. I was there in her room when she died, pushed up against the wall as the doctors and nurses tried their best to revive her. By the time my father got there, I had been sitting and crying by my mother's deathbed for 2 hours. Mom had been my sole guardian, my staunch caretaker, and her absence had left me numb and spiteful. I was mad at many things in my life, but above all else, I was mad at Santa Claus. As children, we believed Santa to be some kind of all-powerful totem of the holidays. If you write a letter to Santa, he will bring you your heart's desire. He will make any wish a reality. As adults, we know better, but as children, we believe that Santa is the genie from Aladdin mixed with Jesus Christ himself, and his powers around the holidays are unwavering and unarguable. In my 7-year-old mind, If I had asked him to save my mother and he hadn't, then it was because he didn't want to. This turned me into a mean and spiteful 8-year-old. My father brought a new woman home, one of his secretaries from the office named Cindy. She was sleeping in my mother's bed, moving her things around, and replacing my mother in almost every way. Looking back through the lens of time, Cindy was a very nice lady, and if I'd given her a chance, she would have probably made a very good mother for me. Cindy cooked my meals, she cleaned the house, she tried her best to be my friend, and I gave her nothing but hate. My mother, the focal point of my life, had died after all. To have this woman in her house, sleeping in her bed, even wearing her clothes, was an affront. I told her that she was worthless daily, told her that I hated her, told her that she would never even come close to being my mother, and in spite of all that, she tried to love me. They got married 6 months after my mother died. I spent the first 3 months of their marriage making their lives a living hell. I refused every meal Cindy made me. I destroyed any room I was left alone in, and then lied and said I had no idea how it had gotten that way. I went out of my way to be an inconvenience to her, telling her I needed things for school or would really like this one particular thing in my nicest, sweetest voice, and then disregard or right out refuse to take anything she brought back. Sometimes I would destroy the gift she gave me right in front of her. When she got me a beautiful dress for fall, a dress I would actually have liked to have worn, I tore it to pieces as she and my father watched, and then stormed to my room and slammed the door. I knew, you see, that I was safe from punishment no matter what I did. Father never cared what I did, as long as I didn't do it in his office, and since Mother had always been responsible for the house and the children, he expected Cindy to take me in hand, a task she was unsuited for. Cindy was more prone to tears than screams in the face of my misbehavior, but something was happening that even I hadn't foreseen, and it changed my antics forever. In October, Cindy became pregnant. By November, it was official, and my father was ecstatic at the idea of another child. This confused me, because he'd never shown the slightest interest in me at any point. Cindy was immediately the center of his universe. He hired a maid to clean and cook and look after me. I don't remember her name, but we went through 3 maids by December because of my antics. I made their lives a living hell, and whatever my father was paying them was clearly not enough to put up with me. The last one, I think her name was Rosemary, didn't speak English, but had a way about her that told me she was not going to leave because of a brat like me. I can remember being picked up in those 2 large arms and carried to my room as I kicked and bit and screamed. She would deposit me on the floor and lock my door so I couldn't escape and ruin her work. She knew how the house worked too, it seemed, and she knew that my timeouts wouldn't be commented on by Cindy or my father. By December 1st, I'd had enough of Cindy and her constant attention. The baby only made me hate her more, and as people continued to shower her with attention, my hatred burned hotter and hotter. Rosemary started keeping a closer eye on me as Cindy's pregnancy continued, but she really needn't have bothered. I wasn't what you call a planner, and when my chance came, I almost missed it. Looking back on it as an adult, I realized just how cruel I was at that moment. Cindy wanted nothing but a child that would love her, something I was never going to do, and the baby was her way of making my mother's house a home as well. I couldn't have that. I was at the top of the stairs, playing with dolls, when Cindy started up with a basket of laundry. Normally that would be Rosemary's job, but the maid had caught a cold, and my father had given her the week off, so she didn't make Cindy sick. Cindy was not supposed to be doing chores. She was under strict orders to be taking it easy and not straining herself. But she was trying to pick up a little, so Rosemary wouldn't have such a heavy workload when she came back. She'd come tottering up the stairs, basket obscuring her view, and I suddenly had a plan to make this all go away forever. I picked up my Barbie dream car and placed it precariously on the top step where I knew she'd put her foot down. I was young, but don't think for a second that I was naive. I knew a fall down the stairs would likely kill her, and if it didn't, it would likely get rid of the baby forever. She was midway up when a voice in my head tried to talk me out of it. "You shouldn't hurt her. It's not okay to hurt people." My conscience always spoke to me in my mother's voice, but I was doing this for her. Couldn't she see that? "You're going to risk killing her and her baby Because of something your father did? I didn't care. I hated her too much. You're going to get in a lot of trouble for doing it. That made me think for a moment, but by then, it was already too late. Her house slipper came down on the car, and I watched her fall backwards down the stairs with a loud scream. The clothes went flying everywhere, and as she fell, I saw her wrap her arms protectively around her belly. She curled in a ball as she fell, and when she hit the first step, I knew she'd broken something. She hit 3 more steps before coming to rest at the bottom, still hugging her stomach as she lay crying, the laundry basket covering her as she came to rest. There she lay in a puddle of clothes and carpet, and from my vantage point, I could see the first thin trickles of blood as they coursed from underneath. The ambulance arrived in time to save her. Dad had been at the office when Rosemary had called him. She had come running in about 5 minutes after Cindy had fallen and called the ambulance after making sure I was okay. She sat with Cindy at the bottom of the stairs, cradling her head and talking to her in that too-fast Spanish she always used when it was just the two of them. I sat at the top of the stairs, surveying my handiwork, but Rosemary wouldn't let me come down the couple of times I tried. Rosemary was never fooled about what had happened, and she always looked at me with secret knowledge the few more times we had reason to be together. Dad beat the ambulance home, but only just. He rode in the ambulance with Sydney, thanking Rosemary for coming over so suddenly, and left me with the housekeeper while he went to go see about his new wife and child. Rosemary started dinner, and I played in my room, and sometime later, after dinner I think, my father came home. He called both of us to the living room, giving Rosemary the honor of joining in the news, and filled us in on Cindy and the baby. He told us that Cindy was going to stay in the hospital for a while. She'd broken several bones and scraped her back up pretty badly, and had possibly injured her spine. The doctors weren't sure how badly she was hurt, but they did say that she had lost the baby. Rosemary cried a little, but I didn't. I had wanted this to happen, but now that it had, all I could feel was numbness. I had killed something. Not a bug or anything, but a real person, and I was no longer sure how I felt about it. I left before he was done talking, but he didn't seem to mind. How quickly things would change. Dad went to the hospital early the next morning. He was on his way out the door when I reminded him that he'd promised to take me to see Santa. It was a promise he had made days ago, a promise I believed he'd forgotten. But when I reminded him of it, I put enough whine on my voice to make it sound like it was something I'd been looking forward to. I knew there was no Santa, of course, back when I thought I knew so much, but I knew that the mall would be crowded, and it would force him to spend time with me. At the end of the day, I guess all I wanted was my father to show me that he cared. He asked Rosemary to take me instead, and he went off to see Cindy in the hospital. We rode to the mall in the town car as a palpable silence hung between us. "What are you going to ask St. Nicholas for?" she asked conversationally. "There is no Santa Claus, silly. I'm too old to believe in such things." She was quiet for a few seconds, before, almost whispering, "You are very wrong." "What?" I asked, shocked out of my pouty huff. No adult had ever contradicted me, not even my mother, and to be contradicted by the help was just unthinkable. I said, "You are very wrong. Just because you do not believe in something doesn't mean it isn't so. It matters not whether you believe in a thing or not, only whether or not it believes in you." She spoke matter-of-factly in her thick Spanish accent. I turned away, ignoring her and pretending she didn't exist. I was a spoiled brat, a naughty child that needed a lesson in how the world worked. I didn't know it then, but this lesson would begin sooner rather than later. This lesson would be the only lesson worth learning. We waited in line for an hour and a half. Rosemary had walked me to the middle of the crowded mall, shoppers moving to and fro and families laughing as they moved from shop to shop, all while Christmas music played in the background. Santa's stage had been set up in front of the big fountain in the middle of the mall, and it looked just as goofy and phony as it always did. There was a long snake of children that trailed away from it, curving around like a magic circle. Rosemary sat on a nearby bench and told me to stand in line. "I'm much too old to see him, but if you would receive his judgment, then you must wait." I fidgeted nervously as I waited, throngs of happy families crowding around me, and sighed as the line moved slower and slower. Why was I waiting in this line? I didn't believe in Santa Claus. If Santa was real, he'd have saved my mother. Even if I had still believed, this was just going to be some half-drunk fat guy they'd stuffed into a suit who smelled like kids' pee and barely talked. It was ridiculous to stand here and wait for my turn to sit on this old faker's lap. But despite that, I couldn't force myself to leave. Rosemary's words had somehow moved me, and it felt more like I was waiting for a confession than my turn on Santa's knee. When I finally neared the front of the line, I could see that my assumption had been wrong. This year's Santa was not a fat man with a cloth beard or some homeless man with a tangled mess of hair. He was dressed all in red, and his suit looked homemade as opposed to store-bought. His beard was a fluffy white bulge of soft-looking hair, and on his round little nose sat a pair of tiny spectacles. His boots looked old and battered, his face was a patchwork of laugh lines, and he practically oozed with good cheer and holiday spirit. The elves, teenagers usually dressed in green smocks and pointy shoes, had been replaced with actual little people, and their costumes were perfect to the last detail, from their pointy shoes to their pointy ears. The whole crew made a jolly, happy scene, and I didn't see one child act scared or unsure of the laughing stranger. When it was my turn, however, the mood seemed to change. The elf who came to get me took one look at my face and almost sneered. His happy, laughing face seemed something almost contemptuous, and as he led me to the jolly old man, I was affixed with the laughing eyes and greeted by the rosy voice. But his face changed as the elves had. He wasn't mad. I saw no anger on his face, but he became almost mournful, disappointed. He allowed me into his lap, and I was surrounded by the smells of old cinders, gingerbread, the woodsy animal smell of reindeer, and freshly fallen snow, but his eyes were still that of a disappointed parent. It was as though he were ashamed to see me in my current state. "Hello, Abigail." How do you know my name?" I said, startled for a moment. He smiled that slightly troubled smile and answered, "Because I'm Santa Claus. It's my job to know all the children." "Of course," I said, sighing a little. "If this guy wanted to play his part, then I'd play along, I guess. Well then, you probably know what I want for Christmas already." "I do, but I know you're only getting one thing this year." I laughed. I couldn't help it. He was just so full of crap. My tree at home was stacked with presents, and I knew enough to know that everything I'd asked Dad for was there. This man didn't know me after all, then. If I wanted something, I got it, and that was all there was to it. I wondered briefly if Rosemary had told him to scare me a little. He pressed a small box into my hand then. "I have a present for you. Something very special. It's something we only give to certain children." It was a small red box with a simple bow on top. It was about the size of a ring box, and when I touched it, I could feel a small electric charge run through me. I nearly dropped it, but I managed to hold on to it as my surprise turned into malaise. A token gift with no real meaning from a mall Santa with no real power. Yes, I'm sure it's wonderful and unique, and I won't see a dozen or so of them in the parking lot on the way out," I said as I hopped off his lap. "Merry Christmas, Santa," I said as I walked back towards the exit. "Merry Christmas, Abigail," he said, almost too low for me to hear, and then he was off greeting the next child as I left. I didn't open the box that day. I honestly forgot about it until Christmas Eve, and though I must have seen it under the tree 1,000 times, I didn't remember bringing it out of the car. Rosemary was silent on the car ride home, but she kept shooting glances at my present, and then looking away quickly before she thought I would notice. She probably expected me to rip it open and see what Santa had given me, but I didn't care what it was. I kept thinking back on the whole experience and couldn't help but feel unnerved. He had just been a mall Santa after all, but something about him had seemed like more than that. He had almost seemed like the real Santa to me. The days came and went. Dad spent more and more time at the hospital with Cindy, something that he'd never done for Mom, and Rosemary and I found ourselves more and more often spending time together at the house. We didn't suddenly become friends or anything, but many afternoons were spent with me on the couch watching TV and her in the kitchen cooking or cleaning the house and singing to herself. She was a patient woman, Rosemary, and after a few days of making life hard for her, I stopped completely. I would just sit listlessly on the couch or lie on my bed and read, and now it almost seems like I was waiting for something to happen. On Christmas Eve, something did. Rosemary was staying the night, Dad at the hospital with Cindy as usual, and if she hadn't been there, I would likely be dead. The fire marshal's report says that at 1:35 a.m., the outlet plugged into the tree shorted out and set fire to the large pile of presents beneath it. Rosemary was asleep in the guest bedroom when the fire started, and upon smelling the smoke, she woke me up, and the two of us left the house as the living room blazed. We dialed 911 from the neighbor's house, but by the time the fire trucks arrived, it was too late. Rosemary and I watched the townhouse burn down, watched the house collapse in on itself, and watched in silence as everything I'd ever known was consumed. I lost everything that night. My clothes, the pictures of Mom, the dresser she had made me, all the cards she'd written me, all the books she'd ever read to me as I drifted off to sleep. All of it was ash in the December wind, and when Rosemary wrapped me in a hug, I didn't feel capable of returning it. I was in shock for quite some time, and when they brought me to the hospital, my father finally came to check on me. He didn't stay long once the doctor told him I was unharmed, which left Rosemary and I alone in the ER room. The police and the firefighters came to talk to me then. The fire was deemed an accident, and everything in the house a complete loss. These weren't the words they used with me, of course. They were sympathetic and told me the local charity was collecting clothes, food, and toys for my family in our time of need. One of the firefighters also told me with a smile that not everything had been lost in the fire. He reached into his coat and handed me a small package that had been sitting under the tree for nearly a week. The small red package with the simple bow that the mall Santa had pressed into my hand. I held the box for a while. It was completely undamaged by the fire. Not even the shiny ribbon used to make the bow had been burned. But when I looked at it, I already knew this was no normal gift. Rosemary was looking at me as I held it, and she seemed to know too what I would find when I opened the box. "Might as well open it, child. Holding off won't make it any better." Inside the box was a simple lump of coal. I've had it tested several times over the years. It's a lump of pure coal, unrefined, unproduced, made with what I now think must be pure magic. It left no stains inside the box. It left no residue on my hands. And over the years, I found it to be indestructible. It was the only thing I received that Christmas, and, to be honest, it was enough. My life was never the same after that day. Cindy was brought to our new home in January. It wasn't as grand as our old house, not even close, but it was ours. Father's time at the hospital had meant that his business had suffered, and so did his finances. Cindy's medical stay was costing him a fortune, so she had had to come home. My medical expenses were costing him quite a lot, and I hadn't stayed long in the hospital either. Rosemary still cooked and cleaned, but Father seemed always on the verge of firing her. He didn't want to. He felt she had changed his daughter somehow, but we simply didn't have the money to pay her. Cindy needed Rosemary, however. Cindy was still nearly catatonic, even after weeks in the hospital. Something had snapped in her after losing the baby, and now she did little more than stare at the wall or soil herself. She would take food if you fed her, and she would drink water if you dribbled it on her mouth, but she didn't move, and she wouldn't talk. Rosemary would often sing to her, something soft in Spanish, as she combed her hair or bathed her, and Cindy seemed to like it when Rosemary was there. It didn't matter, though. Rosemary had bills to pay, and ultimately needed a job as much as anyone. 2 weeks after Cindy came home, Father had to let Rosemary go. I met her at the door and begged her to stay. I had come to like her in the time after the fire. We had come to an almost friendly place. My rage and anger seemed meaningless now, and I didn't want her to leave. She was often the only person in the house who seemed real to me, alive, and without her, the house would seem so empty. She bent down on one knee and favored me with a smile. "I know things seem hard now, but you must be strong. You have no idea how much worse things will become." "How do you know?" I asked, no anger in my words, only a child's terrible curiosity. Rosemary closed her eyes then. "When I was a girl, I had a younger sister named Maria. She was so beautiful, and everyone loved her. I was so very plain-looking, common, and I was angry that my little sister got so much more attention than me. So one day, I pushed her into a well. She drowned in that well, drowned as I stood and watched. And when they found her, they asked me what I knew. I told Father I knew nothing, and it was believed to be an accident. That Christmas I received my own red box, and she reached into her apron then and pulled out a large black rock, just like the one I had upstairs in my room. I received my punishment from him. My father's livelihood was his farm and his ranch, and in the next year I saw his cows die of sickness. A flood killed my mother and siblings. His crops dwindled and his money dried up. By the end of his life, he was a hired hand for a rancher who had been his greatest rival, and after a horse threw him and killed him, I left for America with nothing but the clothes on my back. I do what I can now, in my old age, to make amends for the sins of my youth. You must do the same. I never saw her again after that, but she had been right. My father couldn't turn his business around and was forced to sell his assets. With no one to take care of her, I was forced to be Cindy's caregiver, and I tried my best to use it as an opportunity to make amends for what I'd done. Father sank into depression and started drinking. Who would blame him for drinking, I suppose? He was a failed businessman, a dead first wife, a cold daughter, and a current wife who was little better than a vegetable. He would fly into rages, and when he did, no one was safe from his screaming mouth or his flailing fist. I could forgive him the drinking. I could forgive him his rages. But the night he climbed into my bed when I was 13, I decided I would never forgive him for that. 3 years later, I would leave home forever, unable to take the abuse any longer. The coal, however, followed me. No matter where I went, no matter what I did, it would always be waiting for me, a reminder of my sins. It's been 20 years now since that Christmas. I live in a dingy apartment with neighbors who are either too stoned or too wrapped up in their own problems to notice me. I've never had a job longer than a year, or a relationship that didn't end with me filing a police report. I've been banned from the local mall, several local malls, many times for many reasons, but the most common one is accosting mall Santas, looking for the real one amongst the imposters. I've never found him. I've never found anyone but the sots or the creeps I spoke of when I was in my childish absurdity. I do see him sometimes, though. It's always in December, always as the first snow falls. I'll be on the street, walking to work, or just walking to get out of my apartment, and there he is on the other side of the street, or at the end of the block. He's dressed in the same red suit and cap, the same scuffed old boots, and the same little glasses perched on his nose. He never says a word, just lays a finger on the side of his nose, and smiles his sad smile at me. I always run to him, always try to get to him before he disappears, but when I'm done dodging traffic or knocking people out of my way, he's always gone, and I'm always left crying as people stare at me like I might be crazy. While the cold does curse my life, it also gives me one gift, if you can call it a gift. When I was 13, right after my father slipped into bed with me for the first time, I waited until he was asleep and walked to the cabinet where I knew he kept his gun. I took out his revolver, made sure it was loaded, and put it to my temple. If he'd done it once, I knew he'd do it again, and I wasn't going to live in a home where that was my life. I closed my eyes that were dry as the desert, and steeled myself to pull the trigger. The cylinder turned and the hammer fell, but the gun did not report. I pulled the trigger 5 more times, but nothing happened. I put fresh bullets in the gun and tried again, but nothing happened. Finally, I just put the gun away and slept on the couch. When I was 15, I tried to jump off the roof of the house. I jumped head first from the roof over the driveway. I wanted my death to be assured. I didn't want to wake up in the hospital with a broken neck and no way to escape my father. Cindy was still alive then, still catatonic, but still alive. And though my death would leave her at his mercy, I couldn't find it in myself to care anymore. I just wanted the hurting to stop. I came to on the lawn with a sore back and a scraped up bottom. I've tried many other methods through the years, but none of them work. Someone always finds me, something always fails, the ambulance always gets there in time, my life is always saved. Whatever magic the coal has that ruined my life also helps preserve it. Of this I'm quite sure. Whatever lesson I am learning from my sin is one that will go on for a good long time. I'm writing this tale in hopes that it might save others from my fate. Let your children know, let your friends know, that the songs aren't just songs. We threaten our children with coal, but we don't understand it. We have forgotten that Santa doesn't just reward the just. We sing the songs about how he sees you when you're sleeping and knows when you're awake, but we have forgotten that these things are fact. The coal sits on my desk as I write this, a black-hearted reminder of the hasty actions of a child. And no matter what I do, it follows me forever. So never forget that which sees you when you're sleeping. Remember always that he knows when you're awake. For he knows when you've been bad or good. So be good, for goodness sake. As the coal burns, the coal gives heat. So too does the heat destroy. Coal can sustain a fire, and a fire can be a tool of destruction. As you act in haste, so too does the fire, and never doubt that his fire will scour that which you hold dear. So when you lay down to sleep, pray for only the joys of Christmas. Pray for peace and goodwill towards men. Pray that you never feel the jagged edge of coal in your stocking. They say it's a legend, just a story we tell kids, but I'm here to tell you not to believe a word of it. You would do well to beware the Yule Cat, no matter what they say. My cousins and I grew up in the Icelandic countryside and spent most of our lives within a stone's throw of our birthplace. For 2 weeks in December, my saintly grandmother would welcome us into her home so my parents could go Christmas shopping or have some time to themselves. She had all my cousins as well, a brood of 8 when we were all assembled, and we made quite a houseful. Many nights after Granddad had made his excuses for going off to the pub, Grandma would gather us around the fire and tell us stories. Stories about fairies and Queen Mab and her ilk, and of the elves and darker things that had once been part of this landscape. She told us stories of Icelandic heroes and filled our dreams with monsters that begged to be slain as we took on our favorite champion's role. But especially around the Christmas season, her favorite story was of the Yule Cat. He is a giant creature, capable of stepping over palisades and creeping into tall buildings. He punishes the lazy and rewards those who work hard and do their work year-round. If you neglect your duties, the Jorlakaturinn will find your children. Never doubt. His favorite meal is children without new clothes in the winter, their parents having spent their summers at leisure. Thankless children he hates as well, those who scorn their parents' work in favor of frivolous things. So be thankful, my children, that your parents work hard to keep such dark things away. Most of her stories about the Yule Cat involved naughty children who went into the woods at night, spoiled children whose parents found that the Yule Cat had dragged them out through their window and gobbled them up, and good children who were rushing home on Christmas Eve to get their clothes before the Yule Cat got them. My little brother Sven always held a deep fear of the Yule Cat, but I can honestly never remember a time when I was afraid of him. It always just seemed kind of goofy to me, and in my head I just imagined a giant cat with big wobbly legs that looked like big noodles. Its body was high in the air, and the legs just wiggled around beneath it. I had drawn a picture of it for my grandma once, and she only smiled and ruffled my hair. Let us hope that if your Jorlakaturinn finds you, he is as silly as you think he is. I had smiled about the idea of meeting the Yule Cat then, thinking of all the monsters and beasts my cousin and I had slain in our dreams. I'm not smiling as I write this, though. I came to live with my grandparents when I was 15. My father and mother had been killed in a car accident when a semi slid on the ice and hit them head on. They say they died instantly, but all I knew was that Sven and I were suddenly without parents. There was never any question of where we would go, of course. My grandmother opened her home to us without a second thought. With Grandpa 3 years in his grave, she said it would be nice to have some company, and we moved into her earthy little cottage. I lived with her until I was 23, attending university and getting my degree so I could begin a career in architecture. After graduation, I took up residence in my parents' old home so that I could maintain the family homestead. The house was on my grandparents' land, so it wasn't as though I never saw her again. Sven didn't like to go back to the old house, claiming that there were too many memories there, and my grandmother sheltered him quite a bit. When I moved back, I invited him to come live with me, but he declined. He was 17 and showed none of my ambition. I was worried that if he stayed, my grandmother would coddle him forever, but that was his decision to make. I moved back in around Christmas time, and I decorated my old house like it was my first Christmas ever. The lights and decorations were still in the crawl space, like they had always been, and as I put them up, I began to feel a heady sense of nostalgia. The tree stood in full view of the window, and I had bought enough presents for everyone this year. I had spent much of my life not having a lot of money, and now that I had a lucrative job, I decided to take advantage of the holiday season and spoil my relatives a bit. When I was done, my house had shone out against the darkness like a beacon. I was sitting snug by the fire, a cup of spiced hot chocolate in my hand and a slight buzz making my mind slippery, when the phone rang. My grandma's smiling picture showed from the home screen, and I picked it up as I tried to compose my voice. Grandma was used to people being a little drunk, but Granddad had been pickled more than he was sober during life, and I was still at that age where I was self-conscious about her seeing me like that. I answered the phone, and she immediately started with no greeting. "Care, you haven't come to get your Yule clothes. You need to come back now." I wasn't used to my grandma being so forceful. She was usually very mild, content to smile and let others do what they would, but she seemed upset about this in an irrational way. Tomorrow was Christmas Day. All my cousins and my family and everyone would gather for presents at Grandma's before the usual feast. What Grandma was referring to was her tradition of giving us clothes to keep the Yule Cat away. This was my first Christmas away from home. I usually got them from Grandma when I woke up on the 23rd, but I guess I had missed it since I moved out. "Oh, that's okay, Gran. I'll just get them tomorrow. I'll be there with the others. You can give them to me." "No, you have to come get them now, and hurry. I need you here before the sun goes down, or the Yule Cat will get you." I had rolled my eyes at this. "Gran, I think the Yule Cat will understand if I don't want to go out in the snow and get clothes. Can't I just get them tomorrow?" Her voice went from severe matriarch to pleading older woman in the blink of an eye. "Care, please. It's your first time away from home, and I want you to be safe. I can leave them on the porch if you don't want to come inside, but please come and get them." She sounded scared, and I couldn't argue. I told her I would get dressed and drive over before sunset, and she sighed in relief and thanked me. I dressed warmly in my snow pants and heavy coat. My muffler and gloves came on next, along with a pair of snow boots and a flashlight just in case. All of this went on over whatever I was already wearing, jeans and a t-shirt and thick socks, and I sighed forlornly as I stepped out in the ankle-deep snow. I put a hand on my old Jeep, but decided against it. My head was a little sloshy, and I knew it would only take a few minutes with the heat blasting before I was asleep and sliding on the icy road. Instead, I decided to walk to Grandmother's house, and it was only about 2 miles from here, in the bracing cold, which would sober me up before I got there. I set off towards the woods that separated her house from mine. Every time I walked those familiar trails, I always felt like I should be scattering breadcrumbs behind me. My grandmother's house lies sheltered in the woods, and they always feel so dense and foreboding whenever I have to walk through them. The snow and the cold made them quiet, the less hardy birds having left, and many of the other animals asleep for the winter. The tracks, however, told me that there were indeed things out here. My legs started to get tired almost at once. If you've never had to slog through deep snow, then I can tell you that it isn't much fun. As the sun began to set, I began to regret not taking the truck. I could hear the snow making the trees creak and sag, and now and again there was a scurry of movement as some small creature went about its business. Other than the occasional noise, it was as though I had the forest to myself, and my loud footsteps made me feel like the last person on earth. When I heard the snow crunch nearby, I swung to see what was there. The sound had startled me. My own feet were the only thing making much noise out here, but I found nothing. By the sound of the crunch, I would have thought it was a reindeer, or maybe a large bird trying to forage below the snow. In the dim light, I couldn't even see where the prints were, and I started slogging a little faster, worried it might be a wild dog or something. The crunching came again, but I shrugged it off as my mind playing tricks on me. When it crunched again, closer this time, I started moving even faster. Going too fast would be a great way to break an ankle or fall and impale myself on a tree limb, but the crunching and lack of a source was starting to freak me out. The snowing sky was already overcast, and the sun was setting behind me. The thought of being out here after dark made my skin crawl. The idea of getting lost in a stretch of wood that would become unnavigatable once the sun went down made me quicken my pace again. My footsteps were loud, cutting through the silence like a foghorn, but somehow I could still hear the steps behind me as I nearly jogged through the ankle-deep snow. What I had thought might be a reindeer or a wild dog now sounded like something much larger. It was very rare, but polar bears sometimes got stuck on ice floes and found their way over here. I had seen something online about it, I thought, and I could just see a big hungry polar bear loping behind me as it prepared to make a quick meal out of me. I didn't dare look back as I heard the crunch come down not 8 feet behind me. It hit the ground hard enough to dislodge snow from the trees, and I started booking it as best I could. What the hell was it? Iceland didn't have a lot of large predators, none that came this close to settled areas, and my mind began to travel back to a time when I was young and sitting warm around Grandma's fire. My cousins and I had always loved the stories about trolls and elves, stories of great heroes who slew the former and were aided by the latter, and we always took up sticks when we played and pretended to swing mighty swords at the knees of ugly, hulking trolls. The idea of being devoured by a large, slobbering troll, my mind showing me the one from Harry Potter, seemed less fun now that I was being chased by one through a fairy tale forest. I glanced behind me in a blind panic, not wanting to see, but wanting to know nonetheless, and I felt my boot sink into a hole. I went down, face first in the snow, and nearly head first onto a tree. I rolled over to face whatever was now surely going to get me, preparing to fight. My ancestors had been men who settled this land, men who rode onto the shores in boats with axes and tamed the wilderness, and I would be damned if I would die with my head in the snow like a blubbering baby. What I saw looming over me was no troll. What I saw looming over me was much, much worse. When I had drawn him, I had made his legs look like waving noodles. I had drawn him with a tabby cat coat and a pair of big, friendly yellow eyes. He had been given the Cheshire Cat's grin and a pair of pointy ears that made him look like Batman. He had looked friendly, goofy, something a child couldn't possibly be afraid of. The Yule Cat was none of those things. His coat was black as twice-baked charcoal, and his bones and muscles seemed to shift beneath it, like they might be something living under his skin. Its legs were long and powerful, like a panther or a jaguar, and its paws left tracks as big as hubcaps, with claws like stilettos. His mouth was filled with 2 big teeth, and the tips seemed to poke at his lips painfully as its slaver ran pink from his jaws. Its ears had been mostly chewed off, sitting on its head like rounded nubs that barely seemed big enough to be ears at all. Its eyes, though, its eyes were the worst. Its yellow eyes blazed like torches, their centers crackling red, and when it loosed a long, loud yowl, I felt my snow pants fill with piss. I was saved by sheer dumb luck. Its yowl had loosed some of the snow from the tree over its head, and when it fell, it coated the Yule Cat's face in a cold blanket of surprise. I rolled away, and when I did, the beast lunged at me. It ran smack into the tree I had nearly fallen into and yowled again. More snow fell on it then, and the cat hissed angrily as its claws shredded the tree to pieces. I didn't wait around to be the next scratching post for this thing. I ran through the snow like a reindeer, churning it up as my fear gave me new purpose. I could see the smoke from Grandma's chimney, but I knew I had to be another quarter of a mile from the house. The shadows were gathering, and I knew that I was dead as soon as this thing got its bearings. When it came after me, I realized it had only been playing with me before. Its crunching step sounded dinosauric, and it cleared the distance between us easily. It swiped at me as I ran, and the claws slid easily through my thick jacket. The back suddenly felt cold as the goose down spilled out of it, and I began to realize that I was running on borrowed time. I had to find some way to lose it. I had to find some way to use its size against it. I needed a place to hide and catch my breath, my lungs burning and my head swimming with exertion. That's when I passed the Himmeltree and realized where I was. When we were children, there was a tall tree that we used as a landmark. We called it the Himmeltree, the sky tree, because it always seemed like it soared up into the clouds. My older cousins and I had hiked to the tree once, nearly a quarter of a mile into the woods, and found that the tree lived up to its name. It was massive, 60 feet of wood like iron, and beneath it was a series of roots that looked like a cage. The soil had pushed away from them, and as kids we would crawl beneath the tree and camp in relative comfort. The spot was large for children, but would be snug for me. I was hoping that it would be too snug for this hellcat as well. I booked it, running flat out as the tree soared up to greet me. I jumped over a sprawl of fallen trees, something I remembered from childhood, and prayed that maybe the cat wouldn't be so lucky. When I heard him hiss and stumble a moment later, I knew that his luck had run out. I didn't look to see how badly he had spilled, I fell on my belly and prayed that I had the angle right as I slid between the roots of the huge tree. I thumped my shoulder, the tough old root hurting as I hit them, but I made it mostly under the tree as the cat scrambled after me. I winced as his claws caught my leg, ripping through my snow pants and jeans to sink into meat, but I shook him off before he could pull me out and was soon snug beneath the wooden canopy of the huge old tree. The underside was just as I remembered it. It was damp from snow run, but the frozen snow had mostly covered it, so I was left in a crystalline world of domed white. The cat screamed in agony, shooting a paw between the roots and searching for me in frustration. I huddled against the side of the tree, not wanting to be found by those furtive claws, and stayed as still and quiet as I could. The scrambling went on for some time, but the cat finally removed its sooty paw. I heard it crunching off into the forest then, lumbering away like a large black shadow as it disappeared into the woods. I stayed still, fearing some trick, but it went right on moving until its heavy footsteps were only slight crunches in the distance. I stayed put though, blowing on my hands as my wet pants and bleeding leg began to make me shiver. I would freeze to death out here if I stayed too long, but I was afraid that the Yule Cat might double back and wait for me to leave. I shivered for as long as I could, feeling the temperature drop as the sun crept closer to down. Finally, I decided I'd rather be eaten than freeze to death. I crawled out, and when I wasn't immediately set upon, I started stumbling towards my grandmother's house. She was waiting in the doorway for me, a mug of spiced cider in her hand, and a concerned grimace spread across her face. "He found you out there, didn't he?" It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway. I've been sitting by the fire and letting her feed me and nurse me back to health for a few hours. She bandaged my leg and took my shredded clothes away. She set a plate of food in front of me, and when I finished the spiced cider, she brought me tea and told me to rest. Before she went back to her room to sleep, she dropped a package on my lap. It was a new sheepskin coat, lovely to see and soft to touch. I couldn't imagine what it had cost her, though I knew what it had almost cost me. "He won't bother you now," she said, and made her way to bed as I sat convulsing by the fire. So, heed your elders when they tell you the old stories. I was lucky, but you can't always count on luck. The Yule Cat still lurks in the hills and woods, searching for those he deems ungrateful and underdressed. Don't take the clothes you get for Christmas so lightly, because they could save your life if you find yourself in the sights of the Yule Cat. December 12th. We were getting ready for school when Aaron found the fire truck. It was a big one with an adjustable ladder and small hoses that spooled and unspooled as needed. There were 2 firefighters in the front seat in full gear with their axes in hand and their respirators on tight. Aaron rushed over to the tree in a wild excitement as he started zooming it around the room. I saw something fall out of the back compartment then and flutter to the ground. I figured it was from my dad, Aaron's grandfather, who had been a strict disciplinarian turned soft old grandpa in his old age. I picked it up and opened it. There was a message inside, and it was short and a little cryptic. "To remind you of the first time you strayed. S." The first time I'd what? That was clearly not meant for Aaron. The truck was, but not the note. What was my dad talking about? The first time I'd strayed from what? As I sat and watched Aaron zoom the truck around the living room, though, I suddenly remembered. The first time I'd strayed. The first time I'd been unfaithful. Reggie and I had only been dating a few weeks when Kevin moved into the apartment next door. He was something. 220 pounds, a solid muscled fireman, and he had only had one look at me in my short skirt and crop top before he'd been forced to look away. It took me a few weeks to muster up the nerve to bring some cookies over for him and his roommate, and they had had plenty of time to cool as I flipped the card over to see if there was anything on the back before I crumbled it up and put it in the garbage. My dad had always been a bit of a religious. I guess it came with the territory when you were a minister, but this was going too far. How did he even know? I'd only ever told maybe 2 people about Kevin, and he wouldn't have been able to talk to either one of them. Maybe I'd told Mom, I decided, and figured I'd just let it pass. We were living in their rental house after all, and I didn't want to mess anything up between us. I should have said something there and then, though. December 13th. We got home from school. Aaron found a play school tool belt complete with hammer, saw, and screwdriver. It hadn't been there when we left for school, so I figured it was another surprise from Dad. I set about making dinner as Aaron went around, pretending to fix this and that with his new tools. I didn't give it much thought until he brought me another small note that he'd found in the pocket of the work belt. "It must be yours, Mommy," he said in a childish treble. "I can't read." And then he went back to playing. Great, another sermon from my father. This one was short too, to remind you of the handyman who was oh so handy. S. That would be Jim. Jim was our handyman. Reggie had hired him to fix the place up when we'd gotten married, since he was too busy at work to do his own repairs. The house had been a gift from Reggie on our wedding day. His parents had left him a small fortune after they died, and he had found a new house for his new wife. He'd been working long hours back then, 12 and 16-hour days, but Jim had been more than happy to keep me company and keep me warm when Reggie was at work. I threw this one in the trash too. My anger clouded my mind, or I might have suspected something even then. Who the hell did my dad think he was? Leaving gifts for Aaron and chastisement for me? I had probably told Mom about Jim too. There was that time when Mom liked to live vicariously through me and my little dalliances, but I couldn't believe that she would tell my prudish father about all these indiscretions. I made a mental note to talk to him and went back to making dinner. I still hadn't grasped the depths of what was going on. December 14th. The police car came next. I was trying to coax Aaron out of his pajamas and into his school clothes. He was having a bad morning, and he'd slept poorly the night before because of the wind. To speed him along, I had suggested that maybe we could see if Grandpa had left another present under the tree today. He got dressed quickly after that, but he laughed and said it wasn't Grandpa leaving things under the tree. "It's Santa, Mommy," he said, as though I was slow not to get it. "Santa leaves toys under the tree." "Of course," I said, pulling on his sweater. "It must be Santa. He's rewarding you for being such a good boy throughout the whole endeavor." "What's an endeavor?" he asked. He was always so curious. "It's just a hard time, honey. Let's go have a look and see if we left you anything while we eat breakfast and get ready for school, okay?" The police car was sitting right in plain sight. There was another note, of course, and this one was preachier than the last. "To remind you of the policeman who gave you more than a ticket. S." My freaking mom had been running her mouth again. I didn't even remember this one's name, but he'd been so cute on his little motorcycle. He had gotten me for speeding, and I had been. But a flash of the girls and a promise to let him put his handcuffs on me had gotten me out of that little jam. We'd spent a hot hour or so in the back of his squad car, and off I'd gone about my day. When I'd caught pregnant a few months later, Reggie and I had been trying after all, but Aaron did have the cop's sandy hair. I called my parents' house, but no one answered. Dad must be out early, maybe shopping with my mom or something, and I decided to call them that night. I'd had enough of Dad and his high-handed notes and his little spoiling gifts. I had never had a good relationship with Dad. What we had now was grudging love on my end, and a father trying his best to support his straying daughter kind of love on his. I would tolerate being in his debt, but I wouldn't tolerate his judgmental ways. I wish now I'd maybe tried a little harder. December 15th. When we got home from school that night, I found the football with a note taped to it. Was he worth it? S. Aaron loved football, of course, but I didn't love the memory it brought. Derek was young, still in high school, and I'd seen him and his friends playing football in the street. From the moment I'd seen him, I'd wanted him. He had long blonde hair, he was built like a professional linebacker, and when he smiled, you could see all the carefree love of life that exists in someone who hasn't had their dreams smushed back in their face yet. He was going to LSU, he told me, as he lay naked under the covers on my bed. He was going to LSU and he was going to be a football star. He'd get drafted by some pro team, and maybe he'd even take me with him. I was the best lay he'd ever had, after all, and being with him had made me feel 16 again. Not a 30-year-old mother who'd never quite lost all the baby weight and knew she wasn't as sexy as she had been once. Didn't Reggie tell me so? Not with his words, but with his actions, with his lack of affection, with his lack of attention. I had liked it. I had liked him. I didn't like this note. I tried to call Dad again, but their home phone went to machine. It was 8 o'clock at night, for God's sake. Where the hell were they? Didn't old people usually go to bed early? I'd call him in the morning, I told myself. I'd call him and put a stop to this. If he wanted to give Aaron toys, he could wait until Christmas like a normal person. This needed to stop. December 16th. That morning, I found the straw that broke the camel's back. There was a children's craftsman workbench in my living room, bristling with tools and little building projects, and Aaron ran to it like, well, like a kid on Christmas morning. He put on the hard hat and went to get his tool belt so he could get to work, but I was already searching for the note. Where was it, Dad? Where was today's sermon? I already thought I knew what it would say, but I needed to see it, needed to read it. I nearly tore it in half opening it when I found it in the tool bench's little cubby. You just couldn't help yourself, could you? You needed seconds. S. Jim had gotten in touch with me after Aaron was a year old. He said he thought about me often and wanted to see me again. Reggie was at home more now, liked to spend time with the baby, so I had gone to book clubs or got a gym membership so I could get out of the house for a while and feel less stir-crazy. These trips were always to a nearby hotel, so Jim and I could rekindle our relationship in private. After 3 sweet weeks, he told me that his wife wanted to try and work things out, and I never saw him again after that. I did tear the note in half after I'd read it. I called my parents' house in a blind rage. Dad picked up on the second ring, and he sounded like he'd been awake for hours. I could hear Mom puttering about the kitchen in the background, and before he spoke, he swallowed a bit of whatever he'd been eating. I could see Mom now as she cooked his breakfast and ironed his clothes, and he just sat at the table and wrote his sermons and got ready for another day of being retired. Good morning, sweetie. Is everything okay? Did the wind do any damage last? You know perfectly well that my house is fine, Dad. I want to know why you keep leaving these little notes and toys under my Christmas tree. I was angry. I was fuming. And I was expecting some high-handed religiosity about being sure your sins will find you out, or polluting the garden of your marriage with strange seeds. But I got none of that. What I got was confusion. Toys? Sweetheart, I haven't been over to your house in about a week. Not since we watched Aaron, so you could go to that office party. We went to see friends out of town. We left Monday night, remember? We only just got back last night. I saw that you'd called, but it was so late that I didn't bother calling you back. I shuddered, my blood running a little cold as he said it. Put Mom on, I breathed. Sweetheart, I don't Put Mom on the phone, I shouted. I must have startled him, because I heard the phone fall out of his hand and hit the linoleum with a hard thump. Someone picked it up, and I heard quiet chatter on the other end. My dad's concerned, gruff voice, and my mother's softer, more consoling tone in answer. She was always the peacemaker, always the Kissinger, always the one who soothed things over. Honey, what's wrong? Is Aaron okay? Did you guys really just get back from a trip? You really haven't been here all week? There was a heavy pause and then, yeah, we left to see friends. We told you that, dear. We told you we'd be gone for a few days. Is everything okay? You sound very... Have you told Dad anything about what we talked about? About my slips from the path a proper woman should take? That's what we always called them. We used the term in tones of deepest sarcasm, but we'd always called my sexual adventures by that name. I would call Mom up and tell her in a mournful voice that I'd slipped from the path that a proper woman should take, and she would tell my father that she needed to take this in the bedroom, and then ask for details as she got her thrills vicariously. No, she said, and I could almost hear her look at Dad. Never, dear. Did something happen? I hung up on her. Aaron and I stayed at home that day and didn't answer the door. I made a trip to Walmart after lunch and picked up a new lock for the door that I installed. If Dad really was playing games, something I was beginning to doubt, he would have to knock first before he played them. December 17th. The little suit came next. It was Saturday, and Aaron was up early to watch cartoons. I told him to make a bowl of cereal and not make a big mess on the floor. I didn't hear any squeals of joy from the living room, so I figured that there was no secret surprise today. I went back to sleep until about 9, and then got up, my own stomach beginning to rumble, to see what I could find to eat. I dropped the eggs on the floor when I looked into the living room and saw what was hanging by the fireplace. It was an expensive, coal-black suit for a child of 6. Aaron was less interested in it, but it didn't need a note to tell me what this one was for. I found one anyway. It was stuffed in the breast pocket, and as I unfolded it, I already knew what it was likely to say. Nothing was sacred to you, not even my job. S. I had slept with Reggie's boss about 6 months after Jim had stopped calling. I couldn't tell you why I did it. I did it because I could, I guess, and his boss just looked so good in his Armani suit. Our fling was passionate, but burned out fast. 3 months in, and he traded me for a newer model, a secretary with high breasts and well-formed backside, and I sulked off into the distance. Tongues must have wagged about the office, though, because this was the first one Reggie had found out about. He hadn't accused me of it. He'd simply asked me why people were saying that I was screwing his boss. I'd admitted to it, and instead of raging or throwing me out, he had hugged me and said he was sorry for not giving me more attention. He said he wanted us to go to marriage counseling. He said he wanted to be a better man, the kind of man that I deserved. I made another trip to Walmart and bought a flip lock for the door. I also bought locks for the windows and a chain for the back door. I considered a selection of guns in the sporting goods section, but I decided against them. Aaron was young and curious, and if he'd gotten hurt with one, I don't know what I would have done. Dad came over while I was installing things and asked what was wrong. I told him I'd seen someone around the property and was just being careful. He asked if I wanted to borrow a gun, and I told him no. I didn't want one around Aaron, and I was sure that it was nothing. He shrugged and invited me over for dinner later if I wanted. Then he walked back to the house through the field as he always did. I had lied to Dad. I wasn't sure that it was nothing, and became less sure that it was nothing with every day that passed. The note read, "My job." Dad wouldn't have signed it like that. Only one person would have signed it like that, and that person was currently in a padded room somewhere, eating his meals through a tube and screaming himself to sleep. Reggie couldn't be out, and even if he couldn't find us. He couldn't. December 18th. The gift was a costume. Aaron liked costumes. All children like costumes. But this one was exceptionally telling. I was getting ready for church, a job made all the harder thanks to Dad and his Pentecostal ways, and when Aaron jumped out in the red devil costume, I thought I was going to drop dead of a heart attack. I had dressed him about an hour ago. He only had an hour before he tried to ruin his clothes out of sheer little boy curiosity, and when I came into the living room, I saw them thrown haphazardly over the couch. I'd been trying to put in an earring, and the sight of all those children's clothes scattered about made me so mad that I dropped the back. It rolled under the couch, of course, and as I bent down to get it, I yelled at Aaron to come put these clothes back on and hurry up or we'll be late. When I stood up, there he was, red devil costume and pitchfork held high, as he yelled, "Boo!" right in my face. I fell, tearing my dress and scuttling backwards on my butt as the apparition loomed up before me over the couch. He laughed then, fit to split as my gran would have said, and pulled back the hood to reveal that it was just him. He climbed in my lap and gave me a kiss, my stunned face and overloaded body too keyed up to respond, and said he'd found it under the tree. Santa had brought him a costume for next Halloween, probably because he had missed it this year, and it was so cool and neat, and I barely heard him. I just picked him up and put him in his room and closed the door. The note was lying on the floor next to the tree. Aaron must have thrown it there in his haste to have the costume out. I bent down slowly, and with shaking hands, I picked it up. It was the same notes I'd been getting for the last 6 days. Simply, write your own message notes on a plain white envelope, and I almost dropped it as I opened it to see what my Secret Santa had written this time. A Halloween treat to go with your Halloween trick. S. We'd been in marriage counseling for about a month when I realized that the problem was not my husband. Reggie felt that he was working too much, that he was too focused on his job, that he wasn't an attentive enough husband, and that my cheating was just my way of showing him the error of my ways. He was too hard on himself. I had been kind of a floozy since before we met, but the therapist had showed me something that maybe I hadn't wanted to admit to. The problem wasn't Reggie. The problem was with me. Halloween night, and I was on candy duty. Reggie had taken the night off, and he and Aaron, now 2, had gone out trick-or-treating. He had asked if I wanted to go. All of us had dressed as devils, which I just knew my dad would love when he got the pictures, but I had said no. I told them I was having cramps or some other woman problem, and made my excuses that I'd just slow them down. So off they went, Daddy Devil in his long red cloak and horns, and Baby Devil toddling along at his hand, and Mommy Succubus was free to prowl. Like the cop, I didn't even know his name, but he too was dressed like a devil, and when he sent his kids up the way to keep trick-or-treating, I let him feel a little of my hellfire right there in the entryway. He left with a treat, and so did I. You see, the problem wasn't Reggie. The problem was that now and then, I just liked a little strange. We didn't leave the house that day. The phone rang, but I didn't answer it. Dad came by to see where we were, but I didn't answer the door either. He yelled a little bit when his key wouldn't open the lock, but eventually he left, and I went back to staring off into space as Aaron watched movies on his old VHS TV. He wore the costume, even though I hated it, and before bed that night, I triple-checked the locks and even put a chair under the door. I needn't have bothered. It didn't do any good. December 19th. There was a remote-controlled speedboat and another note. So you remember your time on the water. S. I had met the man with the speedboat while we'd been at the lake house. He was tan and fit, and he'd been watching me sunbathe all day. When he invited me onto his boat, I asked, coyly, if he didn't think his wife would mind. He said he really didn't care, and I found that I didn't either. His boat hadn't been the only thing to go fast, though. We stayed home again, and I made another trip to Walmart. I changed the locks again and bought a camera system for outside. December 20th. We stayed home again after I found a doctor's outfit under the tree. Did you enjoy your weekly doctor's visit? S. Dr. Klein had been my gynecologist for years. His seduction was the easiest of all, and he knew his way around my body better than I did. He dropped me as a client afterwards, but at least he didn't tell anyone. I always thought that was decent of him, more decent than I deserved. I spent the day going over the camera footage. It was a night vision model, so I knew I'd be able to see anyone creeping up at night, but in the hours of spooling through the footage, I found absolutely no one. Not a deer, not a raccoon, not a prowler, not so much as an exceptionally large moth. Aaron was starting to notice that something was wrong, but I told him that Mommy was sick and I needed him to go play so that I could feel better. I found him asleep on the floor of his room, still in that awful devil costume, and trundled him to bed before taking up my vigil on the couch. I stayed up all night that night, sitting in the living room and drinking wine from the bottle. I must have dozed off after I finished the bottle, because when I woke up, December 21st, there was a briefcase under the tree with the initials RF on a gold plate. I looked at the clock on the mantelpiece and back at the briefcase. I had been asleep for no more than 30 minutes, and in that time, someone had come in and left this thing here. I got off the couch and crawled over to the briefcase on my hands and knees. My head was swimming and my heart was pounding, but I needed to see what was inside. I knew who RF was. Randall had been our family attorney and had even been my counsel during the trial, and I was afraid of what I would find inside the briefcase. The combination was put in already, Aaron's birthday, and when I clicked it open, I had to stifle a scream. Inside was a note and a gold signet ring that also had RF stamped on it. The ring was covered in dried blood. I'd counsel you to think about your many sins. S. Randall had been a family friend for years. We'd gone to the same school, the same church, and known many of the same people all our lives. I knew he had a crush on me. He had a crush on me since Sunday school, and I suspected I might need him in my corner at some point or another. When I'd invited him to my bed, you'd have thought Christmas had come early. He was an adequate lover, enthusiastic if not well equipped, and by that point, Reggie had begun to suspect that therapy wasn't working. He'd go right on suspecting it for another year or two, before he finally had his breakdown. I called Dad then. It was the middle of the night, and I expected to find him groggy and grumpy, but for some reason he was awake. He said that something had been nagging at him for a few days, and he'd gotten up to have a glass of water and read his Bible when I'd called. I called him over to the house right then and there and told him everything. I told him about my cheating. I told him about how my marriage had imploded. I told him about why Reggie had gone crazy. I told him about the gifts and the notes and everything that terrified me, and he took me in his arms and calmed me down. We reviewed the footage from my new cameras, and after a few hours, he too could find nothing. He left for a few hours, and when he came back, he had a sleeping bag and a .38 in a holster. Your mother's going to watch the house for a few days while I stay here. We'll catch whoever's sneaking into your house, hon. Never fear. I wish he'd been right. December 22nd. Dad woke me up at 4:30 a.m. and told me to come have a look at this. I'd been startled awake as he shook me, and I detached myself from Aaron and pulled on my house coat as I went into the living room. I'd brought Aaron into my room to sleep. It certainly made me feel better, if nothing else, and he'd wound himself around me in that way that children always seem to. I'd been dreaming of Reggie. Reggie also had his way of constricting me in the night as we cuddled, and in my dreams he turned into a big snake that was squeezing the life out of me. He'd struck at my face just as Dad had woken me up, and I'd probably startled Dad with the violent way I came awake. As I came into the living room, I could see Dad's sleeping bag beside the couch. It was rumpled and looked like he'd come out of it in a hurry. He pointed to the fireplace, and I saw a wrapped box sitting there with a neat card attached to the top. Dad said he couldn't have dozed off for more than an hour, and when he'd woken up, the box was just there. It was a big box, wrapped in holiday paper and topped with a bow. The card looked spooky, almost skeletal, and as I took it, I had already figured out that this present wasn't for Aaron. This gift was for me. We told him how we felt, but how did he make you feel? S. He was talking about Dr. John. Dr. John had been our counselor for 3 years before I finally pulled him off his high horse. I'd had to tell him every one of my dirty little secrets, and I could tell that over the years, he was getting more than interested. He was the one that listened. He was the one who was there, and what he lacked in the looks department, he made up for in experience. I opened the box and immediately dropped it with a throaty scream. It fell sideways, and a pair of arms fell onto the fireplace. They were starting to gray a little, but they were still recognizable. They had been hacked off at the elbows, and they were covered in coarse black hair that ran halfway up the hands. Dr. John had been possessed of very hairy arms, and even the backs of his fingers had little black hairs on them. They didn't have to be his arms. They could be the arms of any man. But I suddenly knew that they were his. I knew how the person knew who all my lovers were, too. John had probably been happy to tell him if it might save his own life. He told Reggie that we were sleeping together after all. I burned them outside in a burn barrel, and despite my dad's objections, I did not call the police. December 23rd. There was no package that morning. Dad was up and making coffee when I awoke, and he handed me a plate of eggs and said it had been a quiet night. He asked if I minded if he went home and got some sleep. I said I didn't care and promised to call him if anything happened. He left me the gun, telling me to keep it out of Aaron's hands, and left through the field back to his house. I wish I'd said more to him. I wish I'd told him I loved him, but it's too late for that now. Aaron and I had an almost normal day. We ate breakfast, watched TV, and even wrapped a few gifts for Mom and Dad as I sat with Aaron and watched Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and Frosty the Snowman tell their tale for the 1,000th time. There was no school to call out from. School was on break until the first of the year, and Aaron and I just enjoyed a nice, quiet day at home. Around 5:30, I realized I needed tape to finish wrapping. We got into the Range Rover and went to the store a few miles up the road. Mom and Pop stores were closed up, but the chain stores were usually open this time of year and could be counted on not to close until Christmas. I got some stuff for dinner, the tape, some more wrapping paper, and wished the bored-looking clerk behind the counter a Merry Christmas as Aaron and I went back to the car. I stopped in the parking lot as fine white snow began to fall all around us. Aaron laughed and danced in excitement, catching the snow in his mouth and jumping around as children do in the snow. The wetness fell around me, but I was lost to it. I had eyes only for the Range Rover, for the windshield, for the monstrous lump that sat in the front seat and grinned at me menacingly from behind the steering wheel. It couldn't be. It was impossible. But there it sat like a cancerous sore on the front seat of the SUV, mocking me. A Christmas present with a familiar white card. Aaron was sullen the whole way home. "I want to open the present, Mommy," he whined as I slid through the deepest snows and tried to call my parents' house again and again. "It's for me! It's from Santa!" "No, Aaron, this present is for Mommy. I'm just sure of it," I said with false glee. The phone in my hand rang and rang and rang again. Why weren't they answering? Surely they haven't gone out now. Dad must be awake. I needed them. For what felt like the first time in my life, I needed him, and I had a sick feeling in my guts that I'd never see either of them again. Aaron and I pulled up in front of their house, and it sat dark and still. 5:30 should have been prime time for my parents. Dinner to eat, paperbacks to read, crosswords to complete, Mom's knitting needles clicking away, and the darkness inside made me feel sure of what I already knew I'd find. "It looks scary, Mommy," Aaron said, and I agreed with him wholeheartedly. I didn't want to take him inside. I didn't want to go inside at all, but I knew I couldn't just leave them in there. I unbuckled his seatbelt and took him by the hand, and we walked inside the dark house where I did not want to go. The door was unlocked. It opened on oiled hinges and gave out none of that creepy funhouse squeal you always hear in the movies. The living room fire was out, and Mom and Dad's easy chairs looked like crouched ogres in the darkness. I flipped on the lights, and the cheery Christmas tree lights blinked into illumination. The overhead lights didn't come on, and as we walked in, I heard glass snap under my boots. The naked light that hung from the ceiling fan had blown, or had been broken, and in the twisting light of the Christmas tree, we made our way to the kitchen. That's where we found Mom. She'd been doing dishes when someone had come upon her, and she hung out of the sink like a rag doll. She'd been drowned. Someone had held her head under the soapy water until she stopped breathing, and now she slumped in the sink like a woman taking a nap. Aaron stepped back, asking what was wrong with Grandma, but I turned him away from the grisly scene and off towards my parents' room. Dad was in there. Someone had cut his throat. I closed the door and took us to the guest room. That was where I opened today's present, the box I had taken from the Range Rover. The box contained a broken pair of glasses and a tweed coat that was drenched in blood. I sobbed as I saw them, knowing immediately who they belonged to. Samuel had been the love of my life. He was a professor of literature at the local community college, and I'd been taking his class as a lark. He was old enough to be my father, but the smell of pipe smoke and old books that hung around him made me feel safe. He was a generous lover. He would have made a better father to Aaron than Reggie could ever have, and I'd been preparing to leave Reggie for Samuel. I never got the chance. Reggie had caught us in bed together. There had been no time to excuse or apologize. Reggie had shot him in the chest 6 times, and then he turned the gun on me. He dry-fired it another 6 times before realizing it was empty. Reggie had let the gun slip out of his fingers, tears streaming down his face, and simply sat down to wait for the police. He hadn't yelled, he hadn't cursed. He just went limp and waited. 2 months later, he was in a psychiatric facility, and I was moving into my parents' rental home. Now they were dead, and I was left with nothing. Aaron pulled on my arm, and I could tell that he was crying. Well, not nothing, I guess. December 24th. I had meant to leave that very night, but when I went out to the Range Rover, all 4 tires were slashed. Ditto on Dad's truck and Mom's van. I locked the doors and stayed awake all night, waiting for him. No presents appeared, no one came to bother us, and now it's midday on Christmas Eve, and I've finally done what I should have done a week ago. What I should have done when I got the box with the freaking arms in it. The dispatcher didn't seem to understand what I was saying at first, but he finally understood that I'm in the house with 2 bodies and a jacket that is likely murder evidence of some sort or another. I'm waiting in the guest room for them, running my hands over Aaron's duck fuzz of blonde hair. He's asleep, thank God, but I don't know how much longer he'll be able to sleep. The police will have a lot of questions, and I'm sure they will have many for him. I never received Reggie's 12th gift, and I don't think I want to. The wrapped box on the hood of my SUV has been there since morning, but the snow has covered it now, and it's little more than a lump of white. Reggie set out to give me a gift I'd never forget, and he certainly accomplished that. I'll never forget how terrible a human being I am, and how little I deserve the love of the boy that's now sleeping on my lap. Reggie managed to do what years of counseling never could accomplish, and for that, I guess I owe him some thanks. I'm all stranged out for the rest of my life, however long that might be, and if you're reading this, then I ask you to feel no pity for me. My 12 gifts have been well received, and the message was clear. I can see him in the front yard now, waiting for me to come out and get my gift so he can give Aaron his Christmas present. The gift of being free of me. I can still remember my mother's look when I told her I wanted to invite Lucy to spend the holidays with us. She furrowed her brow in that way that she often did when she thinks something is a bad idea. Are you sure you want to invite Lucy, dear?" "Of course I'm sure. Lucy's my best friend, Mom." She let the water run over her hands for a few seconds, washing the potatoes she'd been making for dinner. "I know she's your best friend, dear, but Lucy can be a little much sometimes. How long will she be staying?" This was an odd question for my mother. She was usually charitable, but I knew this was the time of the year that always made her nervous. It was the 29th of December. Christmas is now in the rearview mirror, and New Year's looming on the horizon. None of this mattered, though, because my family was 4 days into celebrating the 12 nights of Christmas. My family's Christian, but the sect we belong to believes in the significance of the 12th night. The 12th night was marked by the Feast of Epiphany, and we spent most of the day at service, singing songs and praising God. On the 12th night, we always held a large meal, and Mother always made the turtle to celebrate the occasion. That's also the night that Frau Perchta visits us, and that could be a tumultuous time all of its own. Not a lot of people celebrate the 12th night. Christmas is usually the highlight of the season, but it's a religious tradition that my mother and father brought from France when we moved here. It's been a part of my life for so long that it just seems normal to me. To my knowledge, Lucy's family was not religious at all, so Lucy was looking forward to seeing what other holidays were like. "Her family will be back on the 10th, just in time for the end of Christmas," I said, almost pleading for her not to reconsider. My mother looked at her potatoes as she worked. "She knows that it's not all fun and games, right? We go to church a lot those days, and the celebration is mostly religious." "Yes," I assured her, "she knows it's not all fun and games." That wasn't a complete lie. Lucy had been interested in my family's quaint holiday customs, and I had tried to impress upon her that this time of year was very important to my family. There had been a lot of questions in my class about the 12 Nights of Christmas. I told them how it had more to do with the nativity play and less to do with the song. I told them how we had the turtle, a pastry with a pea in it, and how if you found the pea, you got to be the queen for the evening. I usually found it, and my parents made a game of me being the queen for the night and parading me around the house. Lastly, I told them about Frau Perchta, the old woman who would visit on the 12th night and give out presents to good children. I believed this was the reason that Lucy wanted to stay with me instead of Chelsea or Maggie, her two other friends. Lucy saw an opportunity to get a second Christmas of sorts, and she wanted to use my holiday to get more presents. I wasn't too offended by this idea. I liked extra gifts too, but the idea of her using Frau Perchta to get them made me feel a little funny. Not really guilty, but not good either. Lucy was used to dealing with the kind of generous gift givers like Santa Claus. Frau Perchta was not a benevolent, jolly being. The Frau was honestly a little scary, and I had only just gotten comfortable around her myself. She was a gift-giving entity, which was nice, but she was also a stick that my parents would use to correct me when I was bad. Unlike Santa, the Frau was not just a Christmas entity either. The Frau was always watching, always judging, and they used her year-round lest I step out of line. "Better behave, Frau Perchta will see. Put that candy back, you wouldn't want me to tell the Frau. Better go to sleep before Frau Perchta knows you're being naughty." I had never incurred the wrath of the Frau. My mom had said she would switch me if I were naughty. Mom also told stories of a sister that had gone missing after being especially willful one year. She had never seen her again, and her own mother had always claimed that it was the Frau's doing. Frau Perchta was a coin with two faces, and one of those faces had teeth. Mom nodded stiffly. "Far be it from me to turn guests away during the holidays. Just make sure she's on her best behavior. You know how the Frau feels about willful children." I shuddered as she said the words, remembering the sister she never saw again. Lucy arrived 2 days later, and her parents thanked us for agreeing to let her stay. They were going to see friends out of town, places where Lucy would be relegated to a back room of strange children while their parents gathered. They offered my parents money for her food and board, but they waved it away. Lucy was our guest, and they were glad to have her. Her parents smiled at that, kissing their daughter goodbye as they were off to the airport to catch a flight. My parents had helped Lucy up to my room. Lucy had brought enough luggage for a month, and her luggage seemed to bulge with unnecessary clothes. I showed her the cot we had set up for her, and the spot in my closet I had emptied out for her clothes. She made appreciative noises right up until my parents left, and then she scoffed at the idea of sleeping on a saggy old cot. I saw her eyeballing my canopy bed before she made her intentions known. As a guest, it would only be generous for you to let me use your bed. But then where am I going to sleep? I asked, not quite understanding the trade-off. There was no way that we could share the bed. The mattress fell too short for me sometimes. I looked at the floor, but wrinkled my nose at the idea of sleeping there. I wasn't a messy child, but sleeping on the floor was still a great way to roll over on a Lego or a Barbie shoe. Well, why don't you sleep on the cot? It'll be like you're on holiday, she said, setting her bag on the foot of the bed and telling me about the Barbies she'd brought and the DVDs we could watch. I just sighed and took my princess blanket and pillow and sat up on the cot. This was going to be a long few weeks. My mother thought it was very sweet of me to let Lucy use the bed. I smiled and told her it was the right thing to do for a guest. The cot was lumpy, and I slept poorly on the sagging camp mattress. I thought mean things about Lucy every time I saw her snug in my bed, but I was careful to cut those kinds of thoughts off pretty quick. Such things might be willful, and I wasn't sure if Frau Perchta could read minds. I wasn't in a big hurry to find out, either. The first week went by pretty quickly. Lucy and I played with dolls, watched cartoons in our PJs, helped Mom around the house, and spent our nights giggling and telling secrets. Lucy was always polite and well-behaved around my parents, but she could be a bit of a brat in private. She complained that our house was too small and our food was too bland. It was too cold in here, and the service we dragged her to every night was too dull. I had seen my father shoot her dark looks as she sat in the pew beside me and sighed or fidgeted, but he was too kind to ever say much. She seemed to find our services quaint but boring, and was always ready to go when it was time to leave. On New Year's, Mom and Dad let us stay up with them so we could see the midnight ball drop and toast the New Year with sparkling cider. We sat in front of the TV, watching the New Year's special and waiting for midnight. Lucy told me about how last year she and her parents had been in Paris for the New Year, and her mother had let her drink some champagne when the clock struck midnight. I asked her what it had tasted like, and she said, too low for my parents to hear, it tasted better than this gross juice, and stuck her tongue out as she laughed. When she went to set her glass down, I saw it tip over and spill onto the carpet. She picked it up quickly, and my mother saw the stain before she saw the glass. "Oh no, who spilled grape juice on the carpet?" she asked. Lucy pointed the finger at me. "It was an accident, ma'am. She didn't mean to." I started to become indignant, but Lucy gave me a pitiful look that communicated clearly that she did not want to get in trouble. I didn't say anything, and Mom made me get a towel to help clean it up. When they yelled, "Happy New Year," I looked up quickly, having missed the ball drop. I didn't whisper to Lucy that night. I think she knew I wasn't happy with her. The second week was the worst. Lucy began to complain about the daily trips to church, and even my father's good mood was starting to stretch thin. We had neighbors who agreed to watch her while we went to church. I was honestly a little glad for the time away from Lucy. Her outbursts and snarky attitude were funny at school, usually making teachers grind their teeth and other students laugh. At home, she just came off as a brat and kind of mean. After that, she mostly laid around in her pajamas and did whatever she wanted. Her complaints about our food being too bland or being the same thing every day were starting to wear on my mother as well. I could see her counting the days until Lucy's parents would come to get her, and I had started looking forward to her leaving as well. Mom became a little weird where Lucy was concerned. I heard her calling her parents a few times, telling them how Lucy was missing them, and asked when they were coming back. Lucy had made no such claims. She was clearly enjoying being our guest, and her parents coming back was the farthest thing from her mind. Despite Mom's best efforts, it appeared that Lucy would be with us through the weekend. Mom didn't seem happy about this, and I wondered if she was worried what the Frau would make of Lucy. I wasn't happy with Lucy, but I didn't want her to disappear. The day of the 12th night arrived, and the house was filled with the low excitement that always came around this time of year. Mom and Dad were cleaning wildly, Mom taking breaks to cook the meal for tonight. Lucy and I were relegated to my bedroom so the house could stay clean. Lucy complained about this, of course, and kept asking me questions about the feast. What kind of food would we have? When would the princess cake be served? Which is what she started calling the turtle. Would the Frau be here to give presents before or after the meal? Would we have to go to church to get the gifts? She went on and on and on until I finally told her I didn't know. I was tired of her being here, and I kind of wanted her to leave. Mom had the food ready before we left for service that night, and laid the turtle out under a bowl to cool. The sitter made her way over, giving Lucy a look that clearly said she regretted promising to watch her, and we left for church. The Christmas service was always beautiful. The choir sang hymns, and Mom made me a beautiful white dress for the service. The pastor read a sermon about the birth of Christ and his presentation to the temple. He talked about how on the day of the Epiphany, the 12th day, it was revealed that Jesus was the incarnation of God the Father, and how this was a momentous occasion for people so that they could have a personal relationship and not depend on the temple of priests. I listened intently, having heard the story before, but I always enjoyed the pastor's stories about the life of Christ. I was a little sad when it ended, knowing that I would have to go back to Lucy and her meanness. I closed my eyes before leaving and asked Jesus to help me. I asked him to take this burden away from me, which was something I had heard people say before. Maybe I should have been a little more careful with my prayers. Lucy was dressed in a similar white dress when we got home, a gift from my family to hers for the feast. The sitter left, waving and thanking my mother for the $10 she handed her, but going in a hurry without a backwards glance. Lucy complained about the dress almost at once, saying it didn't fit right and it was too baggy for her. She said the hem was too long and that she kept tripping over it. My mother mostly ignored her as I helped her get the food onto the table. Then we prayed over the meal and sat down to enjoy our feast. Mom had made the red wassail for the occasion. The warm apple cider tasted great after being out in the cold. There were mashed potatoes, ham, fruits and vegetables, both stewed and raw, pies, roast, and of course the turtle, which sat as the centerpiece. We all dug in, and it was the first time I had heard Lucy stop talking in days. She ate a little of everything, her eyes sliding again and again to the turtle, and who could blame her? The pastry glistened with sugar and looked delicious. When we'd all eaten as much as we could, Mom cut the turtle and served us all a piece. Remember, if you find the pea, you get to be royalty for the evening, she reminded us. We all dug in, savoring the tasty tart, and I expected to find the pea with every bite. I think, even then, I believed that my parents let me have the pea every year, so I could be princess of the feast. As I saw my tart becoming smaller and smaller, I began to wonder if they had moved it this year. Lucy was eating as well, but I saw her hand slip into her pocket as she ate, clenching something. Suddenly she sat up, bringing her hand out of her pocket and proclaiming that she had found the pea. I could only gape as my parents congratulated her. Had she just cheated to become the princess of the feast? I didn't have long to gape, however, since as she turned to me, grinning, there was a light tap on our door. Mom stiffened, looking at Lucy and me, saying, "Frau Perchta has arrived." She and Dad left the table, heading for the door, but I stopped Lucy as she started to get up. "You cheated! Why would you do that?" I was less mad than hurt, honestly. Lucy was our guest. We had treated her far better than she had treated us, and this was just needless. I would have let her share the title with me if I had won, but for her to cheat to win was just... My young mind didn't have a word to describe it then. I simply couldn't make sense of why she would do this. Duh! Your parents would have probably just given you the piece with the pea in it. While you were at church, I lifted the corner and saw it in the piece that your mom gave to you. So I took it and put it in my pocket for later. It wouldn't be fair for you to just win, so I cheated, just like your parents were going to. Now step aside, peasant. The princess is off to get her presents. And with that, she skipped off towards the living room. I had little choice but to follow after her. The Frau was seated in the living room when I arrived. Frau Perchta, as I've said, had always scared me a little. She was dressed in a habit, a long white shawl covering her face and framing her ghostly mask that she always wore. The mask was made of dark wood, looking ancient and resembling a smiling ogre. She was hunched, using a cane to get around, and she leaned forward in the chair as she beckoned me towards her with a gnarled hand. "Come forward, child." I took a step, her voice sounding like dry leaves in a hollow log. Lucy stepped forward instead, however, standing before the Frau and jutting her chin out. "Hey, I was here first. I get my gifts before her." My mother sucked in a breath, and my father's eyes got very wide as his skin seemed to pale. The mask bent to look at Lucy, and the wooden thing did not seem to like what it saw. "Run along, child. You are not of my ilk, and I would not judge you by my rules." Lucy huffed out an angry breath. "Hey, I was promised presents from you. What, I don't get presents just because I'm not part of this place?" The wearer of that mask sucked in a long, suffering breath and looked at Lucy icily. "Clearly, you are not part of this place, child. If you were, you would know it was wise to treat me with respect when I honor a household with my presence." "Oh, so I'm just supposed to accept that you didn't bring me anything." She brought the pea out of her pocket and waved it in front of the mask. "I am the princess of the feast, and I want my gift. I'm royalty today, and you can't tell a princess no," she said haughtily. Her bluster melted away when the old woman's hand whipped around her slender neck. "Even if you were the grandest princess in all the land, I answer to a higher power, and I will not be spoken to in such a way. You wish to have my gifts? Please prepare to receive them." She stood, stooped no longer, and carried Lucy's struggling body over to the coffee table. She shoved the magazines and knickknacks off of it and slammed the struggling girl onto the surface. I looked at my parents, but both of them were frozen in horror and surprise. I screamed for them to do something, and my voice seemed to galvanize them. My father looked at Mother, nudging her and whispering something to her that seemed to bring her out of her trance. She moved in front of me, blocking the scene from view and whispering soothing words to me as my friend gagged and screamed. Through the crook of my mother's arm, I could see the old woman take a knife from beneath her robes and lift it over the struggling girl. Her reddening face was terrifying, seeing the knife preparing to gut her as she struggled all the harder. The old woman's grip was like iron, though, and as she tried to line up her blade, she seemed to be having trouble through the mask. The tip hooked beneath the lip of that wooden mask and swung it up to sit on her head, and it was then that she seemed to notice me. She looked at my mother, her dry voice cracked out, bringing her back around to face her. "Do not shelter that girl. Let her see what befall those who will cross the white." Mom looked down at me, clearly not wanting me to see what was about to happen, but moved aside obediently. When I caught sight of the Frau's face, I put my hands to my mouth to stifle a scream. The ogre mask was an improvement compared to what lay beneath. Her gaunt face was skeletal, the nose little more than a flap of skin, and that skin was ice blue and stretched over her skull like wax paper. Her teeth were sharp, like little stones in her mouth, and she held my eyes with a pair of crystalline blue ones that nearly gave me frostbite. She released me a moment later, bending to the struggling girl she was holding against my mum's coffee table, and lifting the knife to get to work. Lucy struggled frantically. She was aware, it seemed, that this was no joke, and that neither my parents nor her parents were going to swoop in to save her. Lucy had found someone who would not give her a pass because she was young and pretty. She had found a creature to which these things did not matter. Lucy had learned too late that sometimes it's best not to keep poking the bear when it's given you a chance to run. When the knife came down, it seemed to surprise her all over again. Her white dress began to soak with blood, the blade cutting through her abdomen and slitting her belly open. The old woman cut into her guts, sticking the knife blade first into the table and dragging out handfuls of ropey entrails. She threw them on the ground, Lucy twitching and convulsing as her life bled away. Her face had gone from red to purple, and her eyes bugged out as the lack of air caught up with her. It seemed the blood loss won out, though, because I saw her bulging eyes roll up to the whites as her purple face slackened into a death mask. She went limp, head lolling to the side, and the Frau reached behind her to grab a scratchy bag from beside the chair. She upended the sack, spilling sticks and pine cones, old wrappers and vegetable peels into the opening before taking out a long bone needle and stitching Lucy closed. She did this with amazing speed, years of practice, I suppose. The Frau sewed up Lucy as her dead eyes stared at the creature's habit, the fabric unstained by blood or gore. When she finished, Frau Perchta sat in her chair once more and motioned me over. I didn't want to go. I had just seen the woman kill one of my best friends, but my mom pushed me towards her and gave me a nervous look that said all it needed to. I approached her chair on rubbery legs, trying not to look at Lucy's bloated form as I passed her. The Frau held out her hand, the blue fingers streaked with gore, and I heard the clink of coins. I held out my own shaky hand, not wanting her to touch me, and she let 4 large gold coins fall into my hand. They too were bloodied, my gift holding its own little warning as she offered it to me. "You are such a good child. Know that I am pleased by your charity and your pure heart. Fear not. I will take care of that one," she said, indicating Lucy. "But you will need to make the proper excuses," she said to my mother and father. They both nodded and shunted me up to bed, my numb fingers still gripping the coins. I don't know how I managed to sleep after all that, but as the adrenaline wore off, I found my eyes growing heavy, and it was morning before I knew it. I expected to find Lucy in my room, fast asleep in her blankets, but she and her things were all gone. Her bags had been taken away, her bedding and her clothes were missing, and when I went downstairs, the living room was spotless. My parents were in the kitchen, their garb from the night before nowhere to be seen. My mother was on the phone with the police, filing a missing persons report. Her voice held nothing but honest emotion, and that's likely why nothing was ever said about the incident, other than regret. "She left in the night, officer. We woke up to find her things gone and the front door open." "Well, she had been feeling homesick, but we didn't think she'd actually run away. We've searched for her since dawn, since my husband noticed she was missing." "No, not a sign of her." "Yes, I called her mother to let her know, and they're on their way back now." Yes, please, officer. If you find anything, let us know. Thank you so much." She hung up the phone and sat with my father at the table, both of them looking at me. "Sweetie, we need to talk about what happened last night." They told me everything. She told me an old story about how Frau Perchta would reward good children and punish those who were willful. Mom told me that she had seen her sister punished in just that same way, the same way Lucy had been. The body and the mess gone before morning, but not forgotten, and certainly not gone forever. They found her body a few months later, buried in a snowdrift. It was one of the reasons that I left the community when I was old enough. The police might not know what happened to her, but I did, and the community certainly did. When the coroner found sticks and rocks sewn into her, the community knew that my mother had raised one of the willful ones. I had hoped that by leaving, I would be able to free myself of the traditions of my people, but when the Frau arrived at my door on my first feast away from home, I knew that there would be no escaping her. She looked at me, her eyes full of pity and resolve. "You will have to do the same. This is your life now. It won't end just because you leave it. The Frau is our burden, the gift given by my family generations ago, and she cannot be escaped. When you have children of your own, you must remember this night and raise them to respect the white. You know the consequences of failure now. If the police ask you what happened to Lucy, just tell them the truth. Tell them you haven't seen her since last night, and leave it at that." And so I did. So I have been doing for years now. I'm a married woman with children of my own now, and I have raised them to both revere and fear the yearly visits of Frau Perchta. My children are good kids, but I will never make the same mistake my mother made on that day when I was young. I will never allow outsiders to stay at my house for the holiday. I will never let my children know the dark secret that I keep inside.